The video played on the 80-inch screen in Hawk Media Group's main boardroom for exactly 41 seconds before anyone in that room remembered to breathe. And every single one of those seconds, I sat perfectly still in my chair at the far end of the table, watching a version of my own face say things I had never said, in a voice that was mine and wasn't, agreeing to leak Hawk's acquisition terms to a rival bidder in exchange for a number that scrolled across a laptop screen the footage claimed was mine. Around that table sat 11 board members I had spent 3 years learning to read the way you learn to read weather, and every single one of their faces, in the seconds after the video ended, told me something specific about how this evening was going to go. Beatrice Coleman, the board's longest-serving member, 73 years old and famous for having buried 3 separate corporate scandals before I was even born, sat with her hands folded and her expression carved from stone. The specific stillness of a woman who had seen this exact genre of crisis often enough to know that the first reaction in the room was rarely the correct one. Leonard Stone, the newest board member, barely 18 months into his seat, looked as though he might actually be sick, glancing rapidly between the frozen final frame of the video and my own face, as though hoping one of them might resolve into something less catastrophic than what he was currently looking at. And Margot Ajimong, head of the audit committee, had already pulled out her phone under the table, thumbs moving, and I understood, watching her, that whatever happened in the next 10 minutes was about to become the single most thoroughly documented meeting in this board's recent history. Ethan, William Beaumont, chairman of the board, my fiancé's father, a man I had spent 3 years calling sir out of habit rather than respect, said my name the way you'd say the name of something you'd just found rotting in your refrigerator. Would you like to explain this to the board before we proceed to a vote on your position? I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I had spent a decade, since I was 17 years old, since the night my father sat in our kitchen listening to a recording of his own voice, saying words he had never once said. 3 days before that recording ended his career, and, less directly but no less completely, his life. Learning exactly what it costs a family when the room believes a fabrication before it believes the person sitting in front of it. I was not going to make my father's mistake, which had been trying to argue with a lie using nothing but his own outraged sincerity. Sincerity does not win against a convincing enough fake. Only proof does. I'd like the room's attention on the top left corner of the frame, I said instead, calm, almost bored, in the voice I used for board presentations nobody found interesting. Specifically, the reflection in the water glass at 11 seconds. If someone could freeze it there. Patrick Thorne, VP of Strategy, my rival for the Chief Strategy Officer seat this vote was supposed to decide, sitting 3 chairs down with the specific stillness of a man who has rehearsed looking surprised and is discovering in real time that rehearsed surprise looks nothing like the real thing, said too quickly, "Ethan, I don't think this is the moment for technical objections." "It's exactly the moment," I said, and reached into my jacket for a small drive I had been carrying in my pocket for 6 days, ever since I had first learned this video existed. 6 days I had spent doing something Patrick and my own fiancé had apparently never once considered I was capable of doing, because for 3 years I had let every person in this building believe I was nothing more than a quiet, competent VP with an unremarkable side interest in cybersecurity. What none of them knew, what I had spent a decade building in absolute secrecy under a name that appeared on no public filing I had ever let my own face be attached to, was that I was the founder of Lucid Forensics, the digital authentication firm 3 government agencies and every serious newsroom in the country now quietly relied on to determine with courtroom-grade certainty whether a piece of video or audio evidence was real. I had built it because 10 years earlier, nobody had been able to prove my father's recording was fake, and by the time forensic technology finally caught up enough to have proven it, 3 years too late, he was already gone, and the correction ran on page 14 of a paper nobody who'd read the original story ever bothered to open again. I plugged the drive into the boardroom's terminal myself, my hands steady in a way that surprised even me, and pulled up an interface none of them recognized, though half the room's own legal and compliance departments had licensed it under contract for exactly this kind of moment, never once realizing the man plugging it in tonight had built it. "This is Lucid Forensics Authentication Suite," I said, into a silence so complete I could hear the HVAC system cycling somewhere above the ceiling tiles. I'd like to run the footage you just showed the board through it, live, right now, so nobody in this room has to take my word for anything. I looked directly at Chloe, my fiancée, sitting beside her father with an expression I was only now, finally, letting myself read honestly instead of charitably. Or Patrick's. William Beaumont's jaw tightened. You have access to Lucid Forensics' proprietary tools? I have access, I said, because I own the company. I have owned it since I was 22 years old. I have spent 10 years making absolutely certain that whatever happened to my father would never again be something a family had to simply live with unproven. Give me 90 seconds and I'll show this entire board exactly what was done to me tonight and exactly who I believe did it. Nobody in that room said a single word for the entire 90 seconds it took the analysis to run, and I have never, before or since, sat through a silence that loud. To understand how I ended up in that boardroom, plugging my own forensics company's software into evidence of my own supposed betrayal, you have to go back 10 years, to a kitchen table in a house that no longer belongs to my family, listening to a recording that took my father apart, syllable by syllable. My father, Arthur Reed, ran a mid-sized political consulting firm that had, for 2 decades, built its entire reputation on a single, unglamorous virtue. He told his clients the truth, even the truth that cost them the contract, because he believed a firm's word only meant something if it never bent for money. He had, 3 weeks before the recording surfaced, turned down a lucrative consulting deal with a rival firm's largest client on the grounds that the campaign strategy they wanted him to run crossed an ethical line he refused to cross even for the size of the check attached to it. The recording that surfaced afterward, grainy, low-fidelity audio, the kind that was easy to write off as authentic specifically because it sounded imperfect enough to seem real, captured, in a voice indistinguishable from my father's own, an admission that he'd been taking bribes from a competing campaign for years, dressed up in his own turns of phrase, his own verbal tics, his own specific way of clearing his throat before he made a point he cared about. I was 17 the night it happened, doing homework at the kitchen table while my father took a call in his study that ran considerably longer than his calls usually did. When he finally came out, his face had gone the particular gray color I would later learn to recognize, 10 years too late to help him, as the exact color a person's face turns in the first few minutes of realizing their life is about to change permanently, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. Ethan, I need you to listen to something, he said, sitting down across from me, and played from his phone a recording a former client had just forwarded him with a single line of text. Is this you? The voice on the recording was unmistakably his, the same slight rasp on certain vowels, the same habit of clearing his throat exactly twice before making a point he cared about, the same specific cadence he used when he was being deliberately careful with his words, describing in detail a bribery arrangement he had never entered into, discussing dollar figures and campaign strategies that belonged to a version of Arthur Reed that had never existed anywhere except inside that recording. I never said that, he told me, and I believed him instantly, completely, without a single second of doubt, because I had known my father's voice my entire life, and something in me recognized even then, at 17, that whatever I was hearing was wrong in a way I didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. I need you to understand that clearly, Ethan, before anyone else in this house hears it. I never said that. By morning, 3 of his oldest clients had already called to terminate their contracts. By the end of the week, a journalist who had covered my father's work admiringly for a decade ran a story treating the recording as established fact, because the audio was, at the time, more sophisticated than anything a journalist covering local politics had any reason to expect existed, and because the recording's producers had been careful enough to leak it through a source with just enough credibility that nobody thought to ask the one question that would have unraveled everything. How, exactly, had this recording been made, given that my father had never, in the 15 years of his professional life anyone could account for, been in a single room with the microphone that supposedly captured it? My father spent the following 3 months trying to explain to people that a recording could be fabricated convincingly enough to fool the human ear, a claim that, in the world as it existed then, sounded less like a defense and more like the exact kind of desperate, implausible denial a guilty man would reach for. Nobody believed him. Not because the truth wasn't available to be believed, but because the tools that could have proven it simply didn't exist yet. And a sincere man insisting a lie was a lie, with no way to demonstrate it, sounds identical to a guilty man insisting the same thing. That, more than anything else that happened over the following decade, is the specific injustice I built my entire adult life around correcting. That sincerity and guilt sound exactly the same to a listener with no forensic tool to tell them apart, and my father paid for that indistinguishability with everything he had built. It was fake. We know that now, with absolute forensic certainty, the kind of certainty that exists specifically because I spent a decade building the tools capable of proving it. Early voice synthesis technology, primitive by today's standards but sophisticated enough, in the hands of whoever built it, to fool every journalist and client who heard it in the 3 devastating weeks before my father's business collapsed. He lost every client he had within a month. He lost the firm within 4 months. He had a heart attack 7 months after that, in the exact kitchen where I'd later sit with my mother, going through what few financial records remained, trying to understand how completely a life could be dismantled by something that had never actually happened. I don't think I've told you enough about what those 7 months actually looked like, because I think the summary version, he lost his clients, he lost his firm, he died, makes the whole thing sound cleaner and faster than it actually was. And I think the slowness of it matters, because it's the slowness that actually broke him, considerably more than any single moment of loss could have. My mother took a job at a pharmacy counter 3 weeks after the recording surfaced, the first job she'd held since before I was born, because our savings, which had always felt comfortable, turned out to have been comfortable specifically because my father's business generated steady income. And steady income, once his clients started calling to terminate their contracts one by one, evaporated considerably faster than either of my parents had ever planned for. I remember a specific Tuesday, 4 months into the collapse, watching my mother sit at that same kitchen table with a stack of bills spread out in front of her, doing math in a small spiral notebook, the same kind of notebook I would later, without fully realizing the echo, buy for myself the year I started building Lucid Forensics' first detection models. My father sat across from her, not helping with the math, because there was nothing left to help calculate, just watching her hands move across the page with an expression I didn't have the vocabulary to name at 17 and have never fully stopped carrying since. The specific, silent devastation of a man who built an entire identity around being the person who solved problems for other people, discovering he had become the problem his own family now had to solve around. He tried, in those 7 months, everything a person in his position could reasonably try. He hired a lawyer to explore a defamation suit against the anonymous source, only to be told honestly that without a way to conclusively prove the recording fabricated, and without any identifiable defendant to actually sue, there was no case to bring. He gave interviews, 3 of them, each one more visibly exhausted than the last, explaining to skeptical journalists a claim that sounded, at the time, less like a defense and more like a man grasping at increasingly implausible explanations. He wrote letters to former clients, long, careful, meticulously argued letters explaining exactly why the recording couldn't be genuine, and received in return mostly silence. Occasionally a brief, awkward reply expressing sympathy without ever actually agreeing to reconsider the decision to leave. I think the moment that broke something in him permanently wasn't any of the large, dramatic losses. It was a small one. The local Little League team he'd coached for 6 years, unpaid, every spring, quietly informed him, through an intermediary rather than to his face, that they'd decided to find a different volunteer coach for the coming season, in light of recent developments. He had coached that team since I was 11 years old. He knew every kid's batting stance, every parent's work schedule, every small detail of a completely unremarkable, unpaid commitment he'd made because he genuinely loved it. Losing his business felt to him like losing a war he'd at least fought honestly. Losing the Little League team felt like losing the last piece of proof that anyone in our town still believed, on any level, in the actual person he'd always been, rather than the fabricated version a recording had manufactured in his place. He died 3 days after receiving that news, and I have never, in the 10 years since, been able to fully separate, in my own mind, the heart attack from the specific grief of that particular small loss. Even though I know, rationally, that 7 months of accumulated stress had almost certainly done the underlying damage long before any single event triggered it. I built lucid forensics, in the end, not only to prove fabrications false, but because I never wanted another child to watch a parent lose the small, unpaid, deeply loved things first. The things that have nothing to do with money or reputation, and everything to do with simply being trusted by the people who know you best. We never found out conclusively who built that recording or who paid for it to circulate at exactly the moment it would do the most damage. My father had theories. He suspected the rival firm whose deal he'd turned down. He suspected, with less certainty, a media conglomerate whose owner had crossed paths with him years earlier over a story my father had refused to help spin. He died without ever getting an answer, and my mother, in the years afterward, made me promise I would stop looking, because looking, she said, had already cost our family everything it was going to cost, and she didn't want it to cost me too. I studied computer science in college with a focus nobody in my program quite understood at the time. Audio and video forensics was, in those years, a niche corner of signal processing that most of my professors considered more academic curiosity than viable career. And I remember the specific, slightly pitying look one advisor gave me when I told him, in my second year, that I intended to build a career around detecting fabricated media. "There isn't much fabricated media sophisticated enough yet to need detecting," he told me, not unkindly. "You might be building tools for a problem that doesn't fully exist yet." He was right in a sense, and I understood even then that being right about the timeline didn't make the eventual problem any less inevitable. I spent my remaining years in school building increasingly sophisticated detection models on datasets I constructed myself, teaching myself to generate crude synthetic audio and video specifically so I would understand, from the inside, every seam a forger might eventually learn to hide. My thesis advisor, a quiet, exacting woman named Dr. Sutton, who remains to this day one of only 4 people who has ever known both my legal name and Lucid Forensics' true ownership structure, told me once that I built my detection models the way other people build shrines, with a specific personal devotion that went considerably beyond academic interest. And she was right about that too, though it took me several more years to admit it to myself as plainly as she'd said it to me. I lived, during those years, in a cramped dormitory room I shared with a chemistry major named Kenneth Lee, who never once fully understood what I was working on late into the night, but who developed, over 4 years of proximity, a genuine, if bemused, respect for my specific obsession. He used to joke that I was the only person he knew who kept a framed printout of a waveform analysis taped above his desk instead of a poster of anything a normal 20-year-old might have cared about. And he wasn't wrong. I had, in fact, printed and framed the very first synthetic voice sample I ever successfully generated myself. Not because it was good, but because building it, badly, at 19 years old, was the first time I understood, technically rather than just emotionally, exactly how the recording that destroyed my father must have been constructed. I spent an entire winter break of my junior year, while most of my classmates went home or traveled, alone in an empty research lab, teaching myself to fake increasingly convincing audio using nothing but open-source tools and a decade-old paper on speech synthesis that most of the field considered obsolete. I generated that winter over 300 fabricated audio clips of my own voice, refining the same core technique over and over, specifically so that I would understand every possible seam a forger might learn to hide, long before commercial-grade generative tools made that same process trivial for anyone with an internet connection and bad intentions. Dr. Sutton found me there on the day after Christmas, having come in herself to retrieve a forgotten set of grading materials, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me work, before she finally spoke. "You're not just studying this technology, Ethan," she said. "You're rehearsing for a fight you haven't told anyone you're actually preparing for." I didn't answer her directly that day, but I remember, walking back to my dorm through the empty, snow-quiet campus that evening, understanding for the first time that my advisor had seen straight through the academic framing I'd been using to justify my entire course of study, all the way down to the decade-old grief underneath it, considerably faster than I had ever expected anyone to. I founded Lucid Forensics the year after graduation with $40,000, most of it borrowed against my own name in ways my mother never fully knew the details of, and spent the first 18 months building a detection engine in a rented office above a dry cleaner, running early tests against every archival piece of fabricated or manipulated media I could get access to, refining the same core insight over and over. That no generative system, however sophisticated, could yet perfectly model the physics of the real world it was imitating. The way light actually bounced off a reflective surface, the precise, chaotic timing of a genuine human micro-expression, the specific acoustic signature of a real room's actual dimensions. Fabrication, I came to believe, was always going to be a process of approximation, and approximation, however good, always left a seam somewhere, if you built a tool patient enough to look for it. Our first real client was a small local newsroom, 3 years into the company's existence, investigating a viral video that had nearly destroyed a city council candidate's campaign 2 days before an election. The candidate, a soft-spoken former schoolteacher named Esther Jenkins, had been shown in footage that had already been shared several 100,000 times by the time the newsroom contacted us, appearing to accept a cash bribe from a developer in a parking lot at night. She had 2 days before the election, no resources for a proper defense, and a campaign manager who told her bluntly that the polling had already started moving against her within hours of the video surfacing. I worked through that first night with a single, borrowed graduate student laptop and a detection model I had built and rebuilt a dozen times over 3 years without ever having a real case to test it against, running the footage frame by frame, cross-referencing the parking lot's actual lighting fixtures against publicly available photographs of the location taken in daylight. I found the seam at 4 in the morning, a shadow cast at an angle inconsistent with the actual position of the lot's single working street lamp, a detail so small I had to enlarge the frame considerably before it became visible even to my own trained eye. I called the newsroom's editor at 5, my voice hoarse from 12 straight hours of talking myself through the analysis out loud, and told her, as calmly as I could manage, that the footage was fabricated and that I could prove it publicly with full technical documentation before the polls opened that morning. The story ran at 7. Esther Jenkins won her election by 6 points 2 days later, and she called me herself, a full year afterward, once the shell structure around lucid forensics had grown sophisticated enough that reaching the actual founder required considerably more effort than most people were willing to make. "I don't know who you are," she said, "and I understand from what your team tells me that you'd like to keep it that way for now. I just wanted whoever built the thing that saved my career to know that I think about it every single day I get to do this job, and I hope, whoever you are, that you understand exactly how much what you built actually means to people who have no other way to prove the truth." I did not tell her who I was. I have thought about that phone call more times than almost any other single moment in lucid forensics' entire history, and I regret now not having found a way to tell her the truth before circumstances eventually told it for me. We proved it fake in 11 hours, the first time our technology had ever mattered to someone other than me. And I remember sitting in that rented office above the dry cleaner at 2 in the morning, watching the story retract, and thinking, for the first time since I was 17, that maybe the thing that happened to my father hadn't simply been an unfixable tragedy. Maybe it had just been a tragedy that happened 3 years before the fix existed, and I had spent those 3 years, without quite admitting it to myself, racing to make sure nobody else's family ever had to wait that long again. I broke that promise the year I turned 22, quietly. The same year I founded Lucid Forensics under a corporate structure specifically designed so that my own name would never appear on a single public document tied to the company. I told myself at the time that the anonymity was about focus, that I didn't want to be the story, I wanted the technology to be the story, so that anyone who needed forensic proof could get it without needing to trust me personally, only the math. That was true as far as it went. It was also, I understand now, a decade too late to admit to myself honestly, a way of making sure nobody who had destroyed my father could ever look at a public filing and realize the son of the man they'd ruined now controlled the exact tool capable of proving what they'd done. I remember the exact evening I decided to apply. I was 31 years old, sitting alone in my apartment reviewing a routine case file, a minor local defamation dispute, nothing connected to my father at all, when I came across a passing reference to Hawk Media Group's advertising relationships from a decade earlier, and found myself, almost without deciding to, pulling up every piece of public information available about the company's leadership during the exact quarter my father's recording had surfaced. I sat with that research until 4 in the morning, and I remember the specific, cold clarity of realizing that I had built an entire company, an entire adult identity around proving fabrications false, and had never once, in nearly a decade, actually pointed that considerable capability at the one mystery that had started all of it. I applied for the VP of Content Integrity position under my own real name 3 weeks later, deliberately keeping it entirely separate from Lucid Forensics' anonymous corporate structure, reasoning, at the time, that if Hawk Media Group's leadership had anything to hide, they would have no reason to suspect an ordinary job applicant named Ethan Reed of harboring any connection to a decade-old grudge, let alone to a company whose forensic tools half their own compliance department quietly licensed. Hawk Media Group hired me 3 years ago as VP of Content Integrity, a title that existed mostly on paper, created in response to a wave of industry pressure around misinformation that Hawk's board wanted to appear responsive to without actually restructuring anything that mattered. I took the job under my own real name, Ethan Reed, entirely separate from Lucid Forensics' shell structure, because Hawk Media Group's founding chairman, a man who had retired the year before I joined and died 2 years after that, was the same media figure my father had once suspected of orchestrating his downfall. I had no proof. I had a decade-old grudge and a company built specifically to turn grudges into proof, and I had decided quietly that the fastest way to find out whether Hawk Media had anything buried in its history worth finding was to walk in through the front door and start listening. I found Chloe Beaumont in my first month there, or rather, she found me, the same way William Beaumont's only daughter finds anyone new and reasonably competent who walks into a building she considers hers. I want to be honest that I did not fall in love with her the way the story is supposed to go. I liked her in the shallow, comfortable way you like someone charming who makes an unfamiliar building feel less unfamiliar. And when she suggested, 8 months in, that our family's respective standing in the industry made a formal engagement a smart, mutually useful arrangement, I said yes for reasons that had considerably more to do with staying close to Hawk's archives than with any grand romantic conviction. I am not proud of that calculation. I have had a great deal of time since then to sit with exactly how much of my own dishonesty helped build the trap I eventually found myself standing inside of. I had hired Isabel Ramirez as Lucid Forensics' lead forensic scientist a full year before I ever set foot in Hawk Media Group, in a hiring process I ran, as I ran everything at the company, entirely through the C. Finch shell, conducting her final interview over a video call with my camera deliberately angled to obscure my face against a bright window, a small, awkward deception I remember feeling faintly ridiculous about, even as I did it. She had, at the time, just finished a doctorate in digital forensics at a program with a considerably harder-nosed reputation than my own, and she asked, during that very first interview, a question none of our other candidates had thought to ask. If I find something in a case that contradicts what the client wants to hear, what happens to me if I report it honestly anyway? You get promoted, I told her, from behind my deliberately obscured camera angle. And the client gets told the truth whether they want it or not. That's the entire business model. If you're looking for a job where you get to shape results to please whoever's paying, I'd encourage you to look elsewhere, because you will be miserable here, and so will I, dealing with you. She laughed unexpectedly, a short, surprised sound. That's the first honest answer I've gotten in 6 interviews this month, she said, and I remember thinking even then, behind my carefully obscured camera, that I very much wanted to keep working with whoever had just said that sentence to me, for reasons that, at the time, I told myself were purely professional. Patrick Thorne joined Strategy 2 years ago, ambitious in the specific, hungry way of a man who has decided his own competence entitles him to whatever position currently belongs to someone else. And it took me considerably less time than it should have to notice that he and Chloe spent more evenings reviewing quarterly strategy together than any actual strategy document could reasonably require. I did not confront either of them. I want to be honest about why. I was, by then, 20 months into quietly combing through Hawk's archived legal files, looking for anything connecting the company to my father's collapse, and a public engagement scandal would have gotten me walked out of the building before I found what I'd come looking for. I told myself I was being strategic. I was, in the end, simply being as dishonest with myself as everyone around me was being with each other. And I think that particular kind of dishonesty is its own quiet poison, regardless of how justified the reason behind it feels at the time. The one person at Hawk Media Group who ever seemed to look past my carefully constructed unremarkableness was a data analyst on my own team named Anjali Okafor. Sharp, funny, and entirely uninterested in office politics beyond the specific extent to which they occasionally made her own work harder than it needed to be. She caught me, 11 months into my time there, reviewing the same archived legal file for the third time in a week, and instead of asking the obvious question, she simply said, "You've been pulling records from the Hawk Estate's old consulting contracts for months. I'm not going to ask why, because I don't think you'd tell me, but I want you to know I noticed, and I'm not going to mention it to anyone, because whatever you're looking for, I get the feeling it matters more to you than your actual job title does." Our friendship, if I can call it that, developed slowly, over hundreds of small, unremarkable office interactions, the way most real friendships actually do, regardless of how movies prefer to compress them into a single memorable scene. She once spent 40 minutes helping me debug a presentation deck the night before a major client pitch, not because it was her job, but because she happened to still be in the building and, in her own words, couldn't stand watching you suffer through a formatting error you clearly weren't going to catch on your own before midnight. She had a habit of leaving a coffee on my desk on the mornings after she knew I'd worked especially late. She never asked why I worked as late as I did, though I suspect, looking back, she'd guessed considerably more than she ever let on, and I found myself, over 3 years, looking forward to the particular low-key rhythm of her company in a way I never quite managed with anyone else at Hawk, Chloe included. "You know you don't smile like a normal person when you're actually amused, right?" she told me once, 8 months into my time there, watching me react to something dry and understated she'd said in a meeting. "You do this small thing with the corner of your mouth like you're rationing the expression. Most people at this company either perform enthusiasm they don't feel or perform boredom they don't feel either. You're the only person here who seems to actually mean whatever tiny amount he shows." I didn't have a good response to that at the time, mostly because she'd noticed something true about me that I hadn't realized was visible. The exact, careful rationing of self I'd spent a decade practicing without ever examining closely enough to see it from the outside. Anjali and I also developed, over 3 years, a running joke neither of us ever fully explained to anyone else at Hawk. She had decided, sometime in my first year, that my perpetually understated demeanor made me the least suspicious person in this entire building, and had taken to jokingly assigning me increasingly absurd secret identities whenever office gossip ran dry. A retired assassin, a minor European royal traveling incognito, once, memorably, a sentient tax form that gained consciousness. I always played along, deadpan, never confirming or denying, which she found endlessly funny precisely because she had no idea, until the boardroom finally made it undeniable, that one of her increasingly ridiculous guesses had, in its own strange way, been considerably closer to the truth than either of us understood at the time. She reminded me of that joke, the week after everything came out, in a message that read only, "For the record, secretly owns an entire tech company, was never actually on my list of guesses, and I feel that's a personal failure of imagination I intend to spend the rest of my career making up for." I never told Anjali about my father, or about lucid forensics, or about anything approaching the actual shape of what I was doing inside that building. What I got from her instead, over 3 years, was something considerably rarer than a confidant. A genuinely skilled colleague who quietly, consistently, made sure my actual work got noticed by the people who mattered, CCing me on meetings I had no formal reason to be included in, flagging inconsistencies in Patrick Thorne's strategy decks before they reached a wider audience, building, without either of us ever discussing it directly, the kind of paper trail of competence that would matter enormously once Patrick Thorne decided the fastest way to remove me from consideration for Chief Strategy Officer was to remove my credibility entirely. Patrick tried something smaller first, 3 months before the deepfake, testing the water the way a man does when he suspects an opponent might be softer than he appears and isn't yet certain enough to commit to something drastic. He forwarded me a set of acquisition figures late on a Friday, CCing 2 board members, with a note asking me to Sanity check these before Monday's presentation, given how closely everyone's watching Strategy's numbers lately. Buried in the fourth tab was a deliberately altered valuation figure, small enough to look like an honest oversight, large enough that if it made it into a board presentation under my sign-off, it would have been the first documented instance of Ethan Reed providing inaccurate financial data to a board that was, at the time, deciding who to promote. I taught it within the hour, the same unglamorous way I caught everything by then, by simply checking every number twice. A habit 10 years of hunting fabrications had trained into me long before I ever needed forensic software to do it for me. I replied to the same distribution list, flagging the discrepancy in flat procedural language, and watched Patrick scramble to correct it within 20 minutes, blaming a formatting error, his tone shifting from casual to faintly panicked in a way that told me, with a clarity I wouldn't fully appreciate until 6 days before the board meeting, that he had already decided I was worth removing by whatever means were available to him, and that he had simply been testing which means would actually work. I told Anjali about it that same evening, in the vague, careful language I used for anything that touched the edges of what I couldn't fully explain. "He's getting nervous about something," I said. "I don't think this ends with a spreadsheet." "Whatever it ends with," Anjali said, "you should start keeping better records of everything he sends you. Timestamps, drafts, all of it. I've seen enough ambitious men in this industry to know that when one of them starts testing small lies on you, he's usually rehearsing for a bigger one." I did not, in the end, keep records nearly thorough enough to prevent what came next, because 5 days of warning, it turns out, is considerably less time than you'd think to prepare for the specific, surgical precision of a fabrication built by professionals who had been perfecting exactly this kind of destruction for over a decade. The deepfake surfaced 6 days before that board meeting, delivered to William Beaumont's private inbox by an anonymous account, timed with surgical precision to land 4 days before the board vote that would have named me Chief Strategy Officer over Patrick. It showed, in footage convincing enough that even I felt a cold jolt of doubt the first time I watched my own face say those words. A private meeting between myself and an executive from a rival media conglomerate, in which I appeared to accept a substantial payment in exchange for leaking the confidential terms of Hawk's pending acquisition of a smaller AI licensing firm, a deal that, once the vote confirmed my promotion, I would have had significant authority over. I found out about it not from William and not from Chloe, but from Isabel Ramirez, Lucid Forensics' lead forensic scientist, who called the private number reserved for exactly 4 people in the world who knew how to reach the company's true anonymous owner, and told me, in the clipped, professional voice she used for everything except the handful of moments I'd later learn mattered most to her, that someone inside Hawk Media Group had submitted a piece of footage to our own public-facing verification portal that afternoon under a fake client account, asking us to confirm it was authentic before they used it, and that our own analysis, run blind, with no knowledge that the footage in question depicted the company's own anonymous founder, had flagged it immediately, unmistakably, as synthetic. "Ethan," she said, and I remember the particular chill of hearing my own real name from someone who, as far as she knew, only ever spoke to a corporate shell called CX. "Finch, I need you to look at this footage yourself, because our system just told me, with 99.4% confidence, that the man in this video accepting a bribe is you. And I don't understand how that's possible unless someone is either extraordinarily good at cloning your voice and face, or you are about to tell me something you've never told me in 3 years of working for you." "Ethan," she said again, when I didn't respond right away, her voice tightening with something between disbelief and dawning fury. "I need you to say something, because right now I'm looking at 3 years of client correspondence signed C. Finch, and a system that just told me, with 99.4% confidence, that the man in a bribery video is the exact same person who's been sending me terse, demanding emails about report formatting since I started this job." "It's me," I said. "C. Finch isn't a person. It's a shell I built specifically so nobody would ever connect Lucid Forensics back to Arthur Reed's son. I should have told you years ago. I didn't, and I don't have a good enough reason why, except that the longer I went without telling you, the harder it became to imagine a version of that conversation that didn't end with you looking at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now. "I'm not looking at you," she snapped. "We're on the phone. You don't get to know what my face is doing right now, and frankly, I'd rather you didn't." There was a long pause, several seconds of nothing but her breathing, before she said, considerably quieter, "Tell me the whole thing. All of it. Not the summary version you've clearly rehearsed for moments like this, the real one." I told her everything, that night, on a call that lasted 4 hours. The first time in a decade I had said my father's whole story out loud to another living person outside my own family. I want to tell you she took it well. She did not entirely, not at first. There was a version of that conversation where she hung up on me twice, furious in the specific, controlled way of someone who has just discovered the person she trusted most professionally had been lying to her by omission for 3 straight years. And I understood her fury completely, because it was the exact same fury I would have felt in her position, and because some part of me had known, the entire time I was building lucid forensics in the shadows, that eventually the anonymity I'd built to protect myself would cost me something real with someone who deserved better than a shell corporation's worth of honesty. But she stayed on the phone. That mattered more than almost anything else that happened in the 6 days that followed. She stayed on the phone, and by the end of that 4-hour call, she had already started, without my asking her to, building the exact forensic breakdown I would eventually plug into a boardroom terminal in front of William Beaumont and his entire board. Those 6 days were, without competition, the longest of my adult life, longer even than the months that followed my father's death, because for the first time in a decade, the exact skill I had built my entire existence around was being tested against a fabrication targeting me specifically. And I understood, with a clarity that kept me awake most of those nights, exactly how my father must have felt discovering that sincerity alone had never been enough to save him. I did not tell William Beaumont what I knew, not immediately, mostly because I needed those 6 days to determine with absolute certainty exactly how the footage had been constructed and exactly who had commissioned it, and revealing my hand too early risked giving Patrick enough warning to destroy whatever trail led back to him. Instead, I went to work each day exactly as I always had, sat through 2 separate strategy meetings alongside Patrick without once letting my face betray what I already knew, and spent every night at Isabel's kitchen table, running the footage through every layer of lucid forensics analysis suite, cross-referencing the specific rendering artifacts against every fabrication signature we had ever cataloged. The second day of that 6-day stretch nearly cost me everything before I ever reached the boardroom, in a way I still think about more than almost any other moment in this entire story. Patrick, apparently unable to resist the specific satisfaction of watching his target squirm before the trap actually closed, stopped by my desk that afternoon, ostensibly to discuss an unrelated strategy document, and mentioned, with studied casualness, that he'd heard some interesting things were coming for the board vote next week. I kept my face perfectly neutral, the same careful, rationed expression Anjali had once noticed I used for everything, and told him I looked forward to it, which was, in its own strange way, entirely true. What nearly broke my composure was what happened after he left. Chloe called me 40 minutes later, her voice bright and warm in exactly the way it always sounded when she wanted something, asking whether I'd be free that weekend to finally set a date for the wedding, since her father had been asking. I sat at my desk, holding a phone call with the woman I was engaged to marry, already knowing she had almost certainly seen the footage Patrick intended to use to destroy me, and I found myself, for one genuinely disorienting moment, unable to determine whether her warmth was real or performed, whether I was talking to someone who didn't yet know what was coming, or someone rehearsing an alibi in advance. I told her I'd think about dates. I hung up, sat very still at my desk for several minutes, and then went back to work, because there was nothing else, in that moment, that I actually knew how to do. I told Isabel about that call later that night, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, gently, "You're going to have to sit with not knowing which version of her that was, at least until the board meeting happens. I know that's a miserable thing to carry for 4 more days. I don't have a way to make it easier. I just don't want you carrying it alone." We found the water glass reflection on the 4th night at nearly 2 in the morning, both of us exhausted enough that Isabel actually laughed out loud when the anomaly finally surfaced on her screen. A short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, the specific sound of relief arriving after 4 days of dread. "It's the lighting rig," she said, pulling the frame up larger, tracing the faint, almost invisible discrepancy in the glass's reflection with one finger. Whoever built this had reference footage of the room's general layout, probably pulled from some internal Hawk presentation that got shared more widely than it should have been, but they never had reference footage of the room's actual overhead lighting fixtures, because those aren't visible in any footage that's ever left the building. The model approximated it. It approximated it well, but it approximated it wrong. Can you build a version of that finding a board full of people with zero technical background can actually understand in 90 seconds? I asked her, because I had already started by then, planning exactly how I intended to use whatever we found, and I knew precisely how little time I would have to explain something this technical to a room that would be, at best, half convinced I was simply making excuses. "I can build you a version a 5-year-old could understand in 30, Isabel said, and she meant it. The morning of the board meeting itself started like every other morning that autumn, which is precisely the kind of sentence you only ever get to write in hindsight, because in the moment, ordinary Thursdays never announce themselves as the last ordinary day of anything. I woke at the same time I always did, ran the same 4-mile loop through the same quiet residential streets, made the same unremarkable breakfast, and drove to Hawk Tower with the drive carrying Isabel's forensic breakdown tucked into my jacket pocket, checking, twice at red lights, that it was still there. The specific, low-grade anxiety of a man carrying something considerably more important than its physical size suggested. I sat through a completely unrelated budget meeting that morning, contributed my usual measured, unremarkable commentary, and ate lunch alone at my desk, same as most days, doing everything in my power to look, to anyone watching, exactly like a man with nothing unusual scheduled for that evening. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think it's the truest thing I can tell you about how these moments actually arrive in a real life instead of a film. They don't announce themselves with some ominous shift in the weather. They arrive at 6 in the evening, in a boardroom you've sat in 100 times before, while you're still holding the exact same coffee mug you've used every single day for 3 years, and the entire shape of your life quietly, invisibly, rearranges itself before you've even finished the sentence you were thinking. 4 days after that final analysis run clean at Isabel's kitchen table, standing in that boardroom with my whole career compressed into a single terminal window, I watched her design do exactly what she'd promised, translating months of forensic architecture into a single, damning red line of text that required no technical literacy at all to understand. Fake. The 90 seconds finished running. The screen resolved into a report neither Patrick nor Chloe nor William Beaumont had ever seen the internal architecture of before. Dense with waveform analysis and micro-expression mapping and a final unambiguous line at the bottom, rendered in the exact clean typeface Isabel had insisted on for every client-facing report Lucid Forensics had ever issued. Synthetic media detected. Confidence 99.6%. Generative artifacts present in audio waveform, facial micro-expression timing, and reflective surface rendering. "The water glass," I said into the silence, "doesn't reflect the room correctly because whoever generated this never modeled the actual lighting rig in this specific conference room. It's a small error. It's the kind of error that used to be invisible to the naked eye 5 years ago, and is now the single easiest thing in the world for an actual forensic system to catch, provided the person running the analysis isn't the same person who commissioned the fake in the first place." I looked at Patrick, whose face had gone the specific gray of a man watching a story he'd built collapse in real time under a light he hadn't accounted for. "Would you like to tell the board where you got this footage produced, Patrick? Or should I pull the payment records myself? Because I should mention, since we're finally being honest in this room tonight, that Lucid Forensics also maintains a database, built in cooperation with 3 federal agencies, tracking known synthetic media production signatures. This footage carries the exact rendering fingerprint of a service currently under federal investigation for exactly this kind of commissioned forgery. I imagine that investigation is going to be very interested in your payment history." Patrick did not run. There was, admittedly, nowhere in that boardroom to run to. He simply sat there, absorbing in real time the specific vertigo of discovering that the quiet, unremarkable colleague he'd spent 2 years underestimating had just casually, in the space of 90 seconds, revealed himself to be the single most dangerous person he could possibly have chosen to frame. Chloe did not say anything at all. She looked instead at her own father, whose face had gone through several distinct stages of comprehension over the course of that 90 seconds, landing finally on an expression I had never once seen on William Beaumont in 3 years of working under him. The specific, ashen look of a man realizing that whatever else was true tonight, his daughter had known about this fabrication before the board ever saw it, and had let it play anyway. Chloe. William said her name the way a man says a word he's afraid of the answer to. Did you know this footage was fabricated when you brought it to me? She didn't answer right away, and in the silence that followed, I watched 3 years of a relationship I had built on my own convenient dishonesty finally collapse under the weight of hers. I didn't build it, she said finally, which was, I noticed even in that moment, not remotely the same thing as answering her father's actual question. Patrick said he had evidence. I believed him. I didn't ask where it came from because I didn't want to know badly enough to ask. That's not the same as not knowing, William said, and for the first time in 3 years, I heard something in his voice that sounded less like a chairman managing a crisis and more like a father watching his daughter's character reveal itself in a boardroom full of witnesses. You let this play in front of the entire board, Chloe. You let it happen to a man you were engaged to marry. I did not feel triumphant watching that exchange unfold. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story where the satisfaction of being proven right eclipses everything else. And that was not, in the end, what I actually felt sitting in that boardroom. What I felt mostly was the specific, hollow recognition of watching 2 people I had spent 3 years allowing myself to believe I might build something honest with, revealed, in the space of 90 seconds, to have never once considered honesty with me a priority worth the effort. The board voted to suspend Patrick Thorne's position pending a full investigation before the meeting even formally adjourned. William Beaumont, to his credit, and I have learned since that night to extend him more credit than I extended him for most of the 3 years I worked under him, did not try to protect his own daughter from the consequences of what she'd allowed to happen. Though he did ask, quietly, before security escorted Patrick out, whether I intended to press charges against him personally for the fabrication itself. Against Patrick, yes, I said. Against whoever actually built that footage, considerably more urgently. Patrick didn't have the technical skill to commission something this sophisticated on his own. Someone built this for him, and I want to know who, because it carries a production signature Lucid Forensics has seen twice before, both times attached to fabrications that ended careers considerably more thoroughly than this one was allowed to end mine. That sentence landed in the room with a weight I hadn't fully intended because it was the exact moment several board members realized this wasn't simply a story about one ambitious executive trying to sabotage a rival. It was the first thread of a considerably larger, considerably older story, one that would take the following 4 months to fully unravel, and one that would eventually lead me back with a specific cold clarity I had spent a decade preparing myself for and still wasn't entirely ready to feel, to the exact conglomerate whose founding chairman my father had once suspected of destroying him. By the time I reached the lobby, word had already reached every floor of Hawk Tower, the way word always does in a building full of people whose entire professional lives depend on knowing things slightly before anyone officially announces them. I passed 2 junior analysts near the elevator bank who stopped talking the instant they saw me, in the specific, poorly disguised way people stop talking when the subject of their conversation has just appeared in the doorway. And I heard, walking past, one of them whisper to the other, not quite quietly enough, "That's him. That's the guy who turned out to own Lucid Forensics this whole time." The other one, wide-eyed, whispered back, "I thought he was just like a normal VP. He's been sitting 3 cubicles from me for 2 years. Anjali texted me before I'd even reached the parking garage. Heard a very interesting rumor just now. Tell me it's true. Tell me you've secretly been a tech billionaire this whole time while eating the same sad desk salad as the rest of us for 2 years. I didn't reply that night, mostly because I didn't yet trust myself to find the right words. But I read that message 4 times in the elevator down, and it was, in its own small, absurd way, the first thing that made me laugh since the video had started playing an hour earlier. Beatrice Coleman retired 18 months later, on her own terms, at a small dinner where she pulled me aside near the end of the evening and said, with the same flat, unhurried composure she'd maintained through the entire crisis, "I've sat through 11 corporate scandals in my time on this board, Ethan, most of them considerably more mundane than yours. I want you to know that watching you plug your own company's software into that terminal was the single most controlled I have ever seen a man behave while his entire professional life was actively burning down around him. I've spent decades in rooms full of people who mistake volume for competence. It was considerably more satisfying than I expected, watching you prove otherwise without ever once raising your voice. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since, usually on days I need reminding that quiet and powerless were never actually the same thing. Margot Agimong's meticulous, real-time documentation of that board meeting, every timestamp, every reaction, every procedural step taken in the immediate aftermath, became, months later, one of the case's most useful pieces of corroborating evidence, precisely capturing the sequence of events before any lawyer on either side had time to shape the narrative retroactively. Leonard Stone, the board's newest and youngest member, told me a year later over coffee that watching that meeting unfold had fundamentally changed how seriously he took governance and compliance concerns for the rest of his career. "I used to think ethics committees were mostly theater," he admitted. "I don't think that anymore. I think theater is exactly what happens in the absence of people willing to do what you did that night." I left that boardroom that night with Isabel Ramirez waiting for me in the lobby, having driven across the city the moment I texted her that the analysis had run clean because she had insisted, over my own half-hearted objection, that I shouldn't have to walk out of a room like that alone. She didn't say anything when I reached her. She just handed me a coffee she'd clearly bought 20 minutes earlier and had gone cold waiting, and I understood, holding it, that this was the first entirely honest gesture anyone had extended me inside that building in 3 full years. Security escorted me down in the freight elevator rather than the main lobby elevator, a small courtesy William had apparently arranged without my asking, so that I wouldn't have to walk past the small cluster of employees still lingering in the main lobby, having clearly heard some fragmentary version of what had just happened 4 floors up. I appreciated the gesture more than I let on at the time. I had spent 10 years building a career around the specific, careful management of exactly how much of myself the world got to see at any given moment, and I was not, in that particular hour, prepared to manage a lobby full of curious faces on top of everything else that evening had already asked of me. Isabel drove in silence for the first several minutes, both of us watching the city slide past the windshield, neither of us quite ready yet to be the one who spoke first. I remember noticing, with the strange, hyper-attentive clarity adrenaline sometimes leaves behind once it finally starts to fade, small, unimportant details I would otherwise never have registered. A cracked taillight on the car ahead of us, the specific tired hum of Isabel's old sedan's engine, the fact that she'd left a half-finished crossword puzzle on the dashboard, the kind of small, ordinary evidence of an ordinary life that felt, in that particular moment, almost unbearably precious, given how close I'd just come to watching my entire professional existence collapse in front of a room full of strangers. "You could have told me sooner," she said once we were in her car, pulling away from Hawk Tower's underground garage. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was something quieter and more tired than that. "I could have," I agreed. "I told myself for 10 years that the anonymity protected the work. I think mostly it protected me from ever having to find out what it would cost me if someone I actually cared about found out the truth and decided it changed everything between us." "It does change things," Isabel said, eyes on the road, jaw tight. "I've spent 3 years thinking I worked for a mysterious, slightly obsessive founder who cared more about forensic accuracy than almost anything else in his life. I still think that. I just also now have to sit with the fact that I've been having entire professional relationships with a man who let me believe a version of him that wasn't complete, while he sat across a conference table from me discussing my own reports without ever once mentioning he was the client I'd been assuming was some anonymous government contact for 3 straight years. I didn't have a good answer for that because there wasn't one. "I'm sorry," I said instead, which felt inadequate at the same time, the way most honest apologies do. "I don't know how to undo 3 years of it in one car ride. I know I'd like the chance to try if you're willing to let me." She didn't answer that night. She dropped me at my apartment, told me to get some sleep, and didn't call for 4 days, which were, I will admit, 4 of the longest days of my adult life, made considerably longer by the fact that I spent every one of them buried in exactly the kind of investigation I had built Lucid Forensics to eventually be capable of running. The rendering fingerprint database itself had started, 4 years earlier, as a modest internal research project that almost nobody at Lucid Forensics, myself included, initially expected to become the company's single most valuable proprietary asset. It began with an observation one of our earliest analysts, a careful, quietly brilliant researcher named Rina Sato, made almost by accident. That 2 seemingly unrelated fabrication cases, submitted months apart by entirely different clients, shared a nearly identical statistical artifact in how each system rendered reflective surfaces, a coincidence too specific to be random. Rina spent the following 8 months, largely on her own initiative, building out a systematic taxonomy of these artifacts across every case Lucid Forensics had ever handled, effectively teaching our entire organization to recognize not just whether a piece of media was fabricated, but which underlying generative tool, and sometimes which specific operator, had likely produced it. I promoted Rina to head of research the year that project matured into what we now call the fingerprint database. And it has been, in the years since, the single most important reason Lucid Forensics could ever have connected a video used against me personally back to a decade-old forgery operation that had also destroyed my father. Because without her patient, unglamorous taxonomy work, the fabrication used against me in that boardroom would have registered simply as one more isolated fake, disconnected from any larger pattern, exactly the way Praxis Media Solutions had spent a decade counting on every single one of its individual crimes to be treated. Rina told me once, over a late dinner during the 4 months we spent building the case against Praxis Media Solutions, that she'd taken the job at Lucid Forensics originally for the most unglamorous reason imaginable. Her previous employer, a much larger tech company, had assigned her to a project she found ethically hollow, optimizing engagement algorithms she suspected were actively making people's lives worse, and she'd simply wanted, badly enough to take a considerable pay cut, to spend her working hours building something she could defend to herself honestly at the end of each day. "I didn't know your specific story when I took this job," she told me. "I just knew the company's stated mission matched something I actually believed in." It's strange, looking back, realizing how many of us ended up here for our own private version of the same reason you built the place to begin with. I think about that conversation often, because it taught me something I hadn't fully appreciated about the company I'd spent a decade building in secret. That the specific personal grief driving my own work had, without my ever intending it consciously, attracted an entire team of people carrying their own smaller, private versions of the same conviction. That truth, verified and defended patiently, was worth building a career around, regardless of whether the world outside ever fully understood why any of them had chosen to make it their life's work. The production signature was the first real thread. Lucid Forensics maintains, in partnership with 3 federal agencies and a consortium of newsrooms who license our detection tools, a database of what we internally call rendering fingerprints, the specific, nearly invisible statistical quirks that different generative models leave behind in the media they produce, the digital equivalent of a printing press's worn type slightly misaligning the same letter every time. The fabrication used against me carried a fingerprint we had cataloged twice before, once in a piece of audio that had nearly ended a state senator's career 18 months earlier, and once, considerably more quietly, in a video that had surfaced 4 years ago during a bitter proxy fight at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. A video that had never been proven fake in time to matter because the company that would have needed to commission the analysis had gone under before anyone thought to ask. Both fabrications, once I pulled the payment trails Lucid Forensics had quietly assembled during our own prior investigations, traced back through a chain of shell accounts to a service operating out of a converted warehouse 2 states over, calling itself, with a kind of grim, unearned confidence, Praxis Media Solutions, a boutique reputation management and strategic communications firm that, on paper, offered crisis PR and opposition research, and that, underneath that paper, ran what amounted to a commissioned forgery operation for anyone willing to pay enough to make a problem disappear by manufacturing evidence against whoever was causing it. I want to tell you the deeper thread. The one connecting Praxis Media Solutions back to my father arrived cleanly in one triumphant afternoon of discovery. It did not. It arrived in pieces, over 6 exhausting weeks, most of them spent cross-referencing a decade-old payment ledger Isabel finally agreed to help me dig through, once 4 days of silence resolved, unexpectedly, into a text message that read only, "I'm still angry. I'm also still the best forensic analyst you've got, and I think you need help finding what you're actually looking for." Let's start with the ledgers. We found it on a Tuesday, both of us hunched over her kitchen table at nearly midnight, cross-referencing an old, informally kept expense record Hawk Media Group's former chairman, William Beaumont's own predecessor, a man named Victor Hawk, who had died 3 years before I ever set foot in the company, had apparently kept, off the books, tracking a series of consulting fees paid 10 years earlier to a firm operating under a name that, cross-referenced against 3 intermediate shell entities, resolved cleanly into the same corporate lineage as Praxis Media Solutions. Victor Hawk had paid, 10 years earlier, for exactly the kind of fabricated recording that ended my father's career. In the same fiscal quarter, my father turned down the consulting deal that would have required him to help spin a story protecting one of Hawk Media's largest advertising partners from a labor scandal. My father hadn't been destroyed by a rival consulting firm at all. He had been destroyed, deliberately, methodically, by the exact company whose current chairman's daughter I had spent 3 years engaged to marry, in order to protect an advertising relationship worth, at the time, considerably less than what Hawk Media Group would eventually spend cleaning up the mess when the truth came out a decade later. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I said anything at all. Isabel didn't push me to. She simply sat across the table, close enough that I could feel the specific, steady warmth of someone choosing to stay present through something that clearly cost her something to witness, and let me arrive at my own next sentence in my own time. "I spent 3 years working inside that building," I said finally, convinced I was hunting for a ghost. It was never a ghost. It was the actual company that hired me, run by a man I called Sir for 3 years, built on the exact foundation my father died trying to survive. "What do you want to do with that?" Isabel asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. It was the specific, practical question of someone who had already quietly started thinking through what proof would require. "I want to do to Praxis Media Solutions exactly what I did to Patrick Thorne tonight," I said. "Except I want to do it publicly, thoroughly, and in a way that makes it structurally impossible for a company like that to ever operate again. Not just for my father. Every single person whose life that warehouse has quietly dismantled deserves the same 41 seconds of proof I got to have in that boardroom. I want to tell you about the version of that plan I almost pursued instead, because I think it matters, and because I'm not entirely proud of how close I came to choosing it. Somewhere around the second week of the investigation, sitting alone in my apartment at 2 in the morning with Victor Hawk's ledger open on my laptop, I found myself drafting, in a private document I never showed to Isabel or anyone else, an entirely different kind of plan. One that would have used lucid forensics' considerable reach and reputation to quietly, methodically destroy Hawk Media Group's entire public standing, leveraging every media relationship the company had left, dismantling it the same slow, deliberate way it had once helped dismantle my father, simply because some part of me, at 2 in the morning, wanted the company that had built my father's ruin to feel, in full, exactly what that kind of ruin actually cost. I deleted that document the next morning. I want to be honest about why, because I don't think it was some clean, immediate moral clarity that stopped me. It was mostly a single memory. My father, in the last conversation I ever had with him, 3 days before the heart attack, telling me, with a tiredness I hadn't understood until years later, "Don't let what happened to me turn you into someone who thinks destroying people is the same thing as justice, Ethan. The whole reason this happened to us is that someone decided destroying a person was an acceptable price for protecting a business relationship. Don't become the kind of person who makes that same trade, even against people who deserve it more than I did." I had spent a decade building a company specifically to prove fabrications false. I understood, deleting that document, that using it as a weapon to manufacture a different kind of ruin, however deserved it might feel at 2 in the morning, would have made me exactly the kind of person Praxis Media Solutions clients had always been. Someone willing to destroy a truth-telling process in service of a personal reckoning. I built Lucid Forensics to correct exactly that impulse in the world. I wasn't going to let it become the instrument of the same impulse in me. I kept that private document's existence a secret from everyone except Isabel for a long time, mostly out of a lingering embarrassment at having drafted it at all. And it wasn't until years later, telling this entire story to a journalist writing a longer feature on Lucid Forensics' founding, that I finally decided the temptation itself was worth admitting to publicly. I think people assume the hardest part of what I do is the technical work, I told her. It isn't. The hardest part is the 2 in the morning decision about what you're actually willing to become in pursuit of correcting a wrong done to you. I got that decision right eventually. I want people to know it wasn't automatic. I had to actively choose it, against a version of myself that very badly wanted something else. What I chose instead, public, precise, evidence-driven accountability, delivered through the courts and a voluntary partnership with the very company whose founder had wronged my father, cost me the specific, savage satisfaction that private ledger document would have offered. It gave me, in exchange, something I think has mattered considerably more in the years since. A company that still exists, still employs several thousand people who had nothing to do with Victor Hawk's decisions, and a chairman who, given an actual choice instead of an ultimatum, chose to help correct the record rather than simply survive it. I've thought a great deal in the years since about the specific difference between justice and revenge, because I think it's a distinction people invoke casually without always meaning it rigorously, and I don't think I fully understood it myself until I was standing at that 2 in the morning crossroads, choosing between them. Revenge, I've come to believe, is measured entirely by what it costs the person you're aiming it at. Justice is measured by whether the outcome would hold up if a stranger with no stake in the story examined it afterward and found it fair. My private ledger document would have felt, in the moment, indistinguishable from justice, because Hawk Media Group genuinely deserved consequences for what its founder had done. But a stranger examining that plan honestly would have found something else entirely. A company punished not for the specific wrong it had actually committed, but for the full measure of my accumulated decade of grief, delivered onto whichever convenient target happened to be standing closest when I finally had the power to deliver it. That's not justice. That's simply revenge wearing justice's clothing. And I think my father, more than anyone else, would have recognized the difference immediately, having spent his entire career refusing to let his own clients confuse the two. What followed over the next 4 months was, I will admit, the single most satisfying professional undertaking of my entire adult life, mostly because it required no shortcuts and no luck. Nothing at all except the patient, methodical application of a technology I had spent a decade building specifically for exactly this purpose. Lucid Forensics ran a full forensic audit of every piece of media we could trace back to Praxis Media Solutions' rendering fingerprint, going back 6 years, and found 11 separate confirmed fabrications, ranging from the state senator's audio to a divorce proceeding where fabricated video had nearly cost a mother custody of her children, to, finally, the original recording that had ended my father's career. I want to tell you about 3 of those 11, because I think the scale of what Praxis Media Solutions had actually been doing only becomes real once you hear it in specifics instead of aggregate numbers, and because several of these particular victims eventually became people I consider, in the strange, unglamorous way these things happen, something close to friends. State Senator Louise Marchetti had been 3 points ahead in a re-election race, running on an aggressive platform against a chemical manufacturing plant's lobbying influence in her district. When an audio recording surfaced 18 months before I ever heard the name Praxis Media Solutions, purporting to capture her privately mocking the very constituents whose water supply she'd built her entire campaign around protecting. She lost the election by 4 points. She spent the following year and a half working 3 jobs to cover the legal fees from a defamation suit she couldn't afford to pursue against an anonymous source she couldn't identify, convinced the entire time that she was simply losing her mind, trying to explain to people that she had never said the words on that recording. When Lucid Forensics' report confirmed the fabrication, she called me herself, and I remember her voice shaking, not with anger exactly, but with something closer to disbelief that anyone, after 18 months, had finally believed her without her needing to convince them first. The custody case involved a woman named Renata Ibarra, whose ex-husband's legal team had produced video, ostensibly recorded through a home security camera, appearing to show her berating her own children in a manner that directly contradicted 3 years of otherwise spotless custody evaluations. She lost primary custody for 14 months, based substantially on that footage, before her own attorney, at the recommendation of a colleague who'd read about our senator case, finally thought to submit it for forensic analysis. 14 months. 14 months of a mother seeing her own children on a court-mandated schedule because a piece of commissioned fabrication had been convincing enough that a family court judge weighted it more heavily than 3 years of documented, genuine parenting. I want to tell you about a third victim, too, because his case has stayed with me differently than the others, in a smaller, quieter way that somehow feels closer to home. A high school science teacher named Gerald Whitmore had been placed on unpaid leave after audio surfaced, appearing to capture him making inappropriate comments to a student, footage that had been commissioned, as it turned out, by a disgruntled parent locked in an unrelated dispute with the school board over curriculum decisions, using Praxis Media Solutions services as an act of pure, petty retaliation that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual substance of the original disagreement. Gerald spent 8 months unable to find work anywhere in his field, teaching being the only profession he'd ever wanted since he was a teenager himself, before our forensic report cleared him and the school board, mortified, offered to reinstate him. He didn't go back. He told me when we spoke on the phone after the case concluded that 8 months of being unable to walk through a grocery store without feeling every stranger's eyes evaluating him had changed something in him he didn't think reinstatement could actually repair. He teaches now at a small private school 2 states away, under circumstances where, he told me, nobody here knows the story, and I've decided I'd rather keep it that way, even though I know now it wasn't true. I just don't think I have it in me to spend the rest of my career being the guy people remember the accusation about, even after the correction. I think about that conversation often, because it taught me something the senators and the custody case's happier endings hadn't fully taught me yet. That even a full, public, forensically certain correction doesn't always undo the actual damage a fabrication does to a life. Some of what Praxis Media Solutions took from its victims, no report, however thorough, was ever going to be able to give back. I sat with all 3 of their case files for a long time before we filed anything publicly, because I understood, reading them, that this had never been simply about clearing my own name, or even simply about my father. Praxis Media Solutions had built an entire business model around the specific, devastating gap between how convincing a fabrication could sound and how difficult it had, until recently, been to prove one false. And every single day that gap remained unclosed, it was going to keep costing people considerably more than they had any way to protect themselves against. We didn't release all 11 at once. That would have been satisfying in the short term and strategically foolish in every other sense, because Praxis Media Solutions, once alerted that its forgeries were under scrutiny, would simply have dissolved its shell structure and reopened under a new name within a month, the same way it had apparently done at least twice before in its operating history. Instead, working with the same 3 federal agencies that had long licensed our detection tools, we built a coordinated case, quietly, patiently, over 4 months, ensuring that when the exposure finally came, it would come as a single simultaneous strike. Civil suits from all 11 victims filed the same week, a federal indictment against Praxis Media Solutions' ownership structure, and a public forensic report, co-published with 2 of the newsrooms that license our tools, laying out every single fabrication in exhaustive, unambiguous technical detail. I was present, at the federal agent's invitation, extended as a professional courtesy given how central Lucid Forensics analysis had been to building the case, the morning they executed the search warrant on the converted warehouse Praxis Media Solutions operated out of. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected to feel much of anything watching it, having spent 4 months treating the entire investigation as a purely technical, evidentiary exercise. I was wrong about that. Standing across the street, watching agents carry out server racks and hard drives in evidence bags, I felt something in my chest finally physically loosen. A tightness I hadn't fully registered carrying for a decade until the specific moment it started to ease. The warehouse's interior, described to me afterward by one of the lead agents, contained an entire production floor dedicated to exactly the kind of work that had destroyed my father. Voice modeling rigs, motion capture equipment repurposed for facial synthesis, a wall of monitors displaying half-finished fabrications in various stages of production, commissioned, as it turned out from the seized client ledger, by everyone from disgruntled business partners to at least 2 individuals involved in ongoing custody disputes, 2, in one case that made even the seasoned federal agents pause. A small-town school board president attempting to fabricate evidence against a rival candidate in a race that, in the broader scheme of the world, could not possibly have mattered less, and had still, apparently, seemed worth the cost of manufacturing a lie to win. Praxis Media Solutions owner, a soft-spoken, unassuming man named Lawrence Ritchie, who had built the operation over nearly a decade using a rotating cast of freelance technical contractors who mostly never met each other or fully understood the scope of what they were collectively building, did not resist arrest and offered, through his attorney, minimal cooperation beyond what the overwhelming evidence already made irrelevant to contest. I never spoke to him directly. I didn't especially want to. I understood by then that whatever answers I might have gotten from a man like that would have told me considerably less about why this had happened to my father than the ledger evidence already had. And I had spent enough of my life waiting on an explanation that was never going to arrive. I didn't need his voice added to the story. I had, finally, the actual facts. Lawrence Ritchie was sentenced 14 months later to 11 years in federal prison, the maximum available under the specific combination of charges prosecutors were able to make stick. And I did attend that sentencing, unlike Patrick's later plea hearing, because I felt my father, more than anyone else in this entire story, deserved to have someone from his own family present for the moment the law finally, formally acknowledged what had been done to him. Ritchie said nothing during his own sentencing, offering no statement, no explanation, no apology. And I remember watching him being led out of that courtroom thinking that his silence, in the end, told me everything I actually needed to know. That whatever had driven a person to build an entire business model around manufacturing other people's ruin, it had never once, in over a decade of operation, included a moment of genuine reflection on what that ruin actually cost the families living through it. I called my mother from the courthouse steps immediately afterward, and I remember my voice shaking in a way I hadn't expected it to. "It's done," I told her. "The man responsible for Dad's recording is going to prison for 11 years. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said simply, "I wish this had happened in time for your father to hear it himself. But I'm glad it happened in time for you to be the one who made it happen. I think, in its own way, that's its own kind of correction, Ethan. Not the one we wanted 10 years ago, but a real one all the same." The seized client ledger, once federal prosecutors finished cataloging it, revealed something I hadn't anticipated and found in the end considerably more satisfying to expose than Praxis Media Solutions' own dissolution. A legitimate-seeming crisis communications firm called Holbrook Strategies had been quietly referring clients to Praxis for nearly 5 years, taking a referral fee on every commissioned fabrication, while publicly marketing itself as an ethical, values-driven reputation management practice, complete with a glossy corporate mission statement about restoring truth to damaged narratives. Holbrook Strategies counted, among its public client roster, 3 sitting city council members, 2 regional news anchors, and, in a detail that gave me a very specific, very petty satisfaction the day I found it, the same rival consulting firm whose lucrative deal my father had turned down 3 weeks before the recording that destroyed him first surfaced. I made sure, once the evidence was solid enough to share responsibly, that every journalist covering the Praxis Media Solutions case also received Holbrook Strategies' referral ledger, entirely on the record, with full documentation. I did not need to write a single word of commentary. The story wrote itself. An ethics-branded reputation management firm had spent 5 years quietly profiting along exactly the kind of fabricated evidence it publicly claimed to help clients recover from. Holbrook Strategies lost 11 of its 14 active clients within a month of the story breaking and dissolved entirely within the year. And I want to be honest that watching that particular collapse unfold gave me a satisfaction I don't feel any need to apologize for. Because unlike the temptation I'd resisted with Hawk Media Group itself, this was simply the truth, delivered publicly, to people who had built an entire business model on selling the opposite of exactly what they claimed to provide. Holbrook Strategies founder, a polished, media-savvy executive named Sophia Vance, who had spent a decade cultivating a personal brand built almost entirely around restoring integrity to damaged narratives, gave a single interview in the aftermath, an attempt at damage control that backfired spectacularly the moment the journalist simply read the referral ledger figures back to her on camera. She had no defense prepared because I don't think she had ever seriously imagined a scenario where the actual paper trail would be laid in front of her, in full, by someone who had already done the verification work before the interview even started. I watched that clip several times, not out of cruelty, but because I found something genuinely instructive in it. The specific, brittle collapse of a person whose entire public identity had been built on a claim she'd never expected to actually be tested. My father built his entire reputation on the opposite foundation, decades of unglamorous, verifiable honesty, brick by brick, with nothing to protect except the truth itself. I understood, watching Sophia Vance's interview fall apart in real time, exactly why that foundation, however much slower it was to build, had turned out to be the only kind that actually survives contact with real scrutiny. Sophia Vance attempted, roughly a year later, to relaunch under a new firm name, a common enough pattern in an industry built around reinvention, only to discover that the same journalist who'd first exposed her simply cross-referenced the new firm's incorporation documents against her, publishing a brief follow-up piece the same week the new venture's website went live. It closed within a month. I felt, reading that follow-up story, a specific, small satisfaction I've never fully apologized to myself for feeling. The recognition that a reputation genuinely built on deception, unlike one built on patient honesty, simply cannot be rebuilt quickly, no matter how many new names you try to rebuild it under. Before any of that became public, I went to William Beaumont directly, in his office, 3 weeks after the board meeting, with the ledger evidence connecting his predecessor to my father's destruction laid out on the desk between us. I want to be honest that I did not know, walking in, whether William himself had known any part of this history, and I had spent a considerable amount of energy over those 3 weeks preparing myself for the possibility that I was about to discover the man I'd called Sir for 3 years had known, the entire time, exactly what his predecessor's company had done to mine. He hadn't. I believe that, to this day, as completely as I believe anything, because I watched his face while he read through the ledger, and there is a specific kind of shock that cannot be performed convincingly by someone who already knows what's coming. And William Beaumont's face did that specific, unperformed thing. Victor hired me away from a rival firm 11 years ago, William said quietly, still staring at the ledger. I always knew he ran things I wasn't fully looped into. I told myself for years that not asking too many questions about his older dealings was simply the price of the job he'd handed me. I never imagined it was this. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in his expression that looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly ashamed. Your father. This is about your father. This is about my father, I confirmed. And 10 other families whose lives Praxis Media Solutions dismantled after him, using the exact same method. Some of them clients this company was still, until 3 weeks ago, indirectly paying to keep operational through a referral relationship none of your current compliance staff had bothered to trace back far enough to notice. William Beaumont did something I did not expect from him, and did not in that moment believe he was capable of. He picked up his phone, called his general counsel, and ordered a full, voluntary internal disclosure to the federal investigation, offering Hawk Media Group's complete cooperation, including access to every surviving record connecting Victor Hawk to Praxis Media Solutions, regardless of what that cooperation might eventually cost the company's own reputation. I built my career telling myself I inherited a company with a complicated past and a clean future, he said, hanging up the phone. I don't get to keep believing that anymore, and I don't particularly want to. I'm sorry, Ethan. It's an inadequate word for what happened to your father, and I'm going to say it anyway, because it's the only one I actually have. I did not forgive him that afternoon. I want to be honest about that, the same way I was honest about not forgiving Chloe, because I think stories like this one too often rush toward absolution the moment someone says the right words, and I don't believe absolution works that quickly, or that it should. What I offered instead was the same thing I'd offered Patrick's downfall and would soon offer Praxis Media Solutions. Full transparency, conducted publicly, regardless of what it cost the people responsible. Because the only thing that had ever actually mattered to me, since I was 17 years old listening to a fabricated recording destroy my father in real time, was making sure the truth finally weighed more than the lie had. Hawk Media Group's voluntary cooperation became, in the end, one of the central pieces of evidence that let federal prosecutors build an airtight case against Praxis Media Solutions' ownership, and William Beaumont's public statement acknowledging his predecessor's role, delivered at a press conference he insisted on holding personally rather than delegating to a communications team, did more to repair whatever trust remained between us than any private apology could have. I would like to tell you that once we had 11 confirmed fabrications and a federal indictment in motion, the case simply proceeded cleanly to its conclusion. It did not. Praxis Media Solutions' lead defense attorney, a formidable litigator named Calvin Albright, who had built a career defending clients against forensic evidence by attacking the credibility of the methodology itself rather than the underlying facts, filed a motion 3 weeks before the first custody case retrial to have Lucid Forensics' entire detection suite excluded as evidence, arguing that our methodology constituted proprietary black box analysis that opposing counsel had no meaningful ability to independently verify, and that admitting it into evidence without full disclosure of our underlying model architecture would violate his client's right to confront the evidence against them. It was, I will admit, a genuinely clever argument, built on a real and legitimate concern about forensic AI more broadly, and, for about a week, sitting in meetings with our own legal team, watching them war game how a judge might rule, I understood that Albright had found the single weakest point in everything we'd built. The same anonymity and proprietary secrecy that had let me build Lucid Forensics into a company law enforcement trusted implicitly could now be turned against us, transformed from a strength into the exact vulnerability a skilled enough attorney needed to throw the entire case into doubt. Isabel solved it in the end, not with a legal argument, but with a demonstration, the specific kind of unglamorous, methodical proof she had spent her entire career building a reputation on. She proposed, to the court, an independent replication protocol. Rather than disclosing Lucid Forensics' proprietary model architecture, we would submit to a blind test, administered by a neutral third-party panel of forensic scientists from 2 universities with no relationship to our company, using 10 pieces of media, 5 genuine, 5 fabricated by an independent lab specifically for this test. None of it anything our system had ever seen before. If our detection suite correctly identified all 10 without a single error, using nothing but the same client-facing interface any court could access, the court would have empirical proof of the methodology's reliability without needing proprietary access to a single line of our underlying code. We ran that blind test in a courtroom annex on a Thursday morning in front of Judge Juliana Navarro, Calvin Albright, 3 university forensic scientists, and a stenographer typing every result as it appeared on screen. 10 for 10. Judge Navarro admitted the evidence the same afternoon, and Calvin Albright, to his credit, did not appeal the ruling, telling a reporter afterward, in a quote I have kept printed and taped inside my own office ever since. I've spent 20 years attacking forensic methodology for a living. I've never once seen one hold up this cleanly under a test designed specifically to break it. Albright called me himself, several months later, in what I initially assumed would be a hostile conversation and turned out to be something considerably more useful. I want to refer clients to you, he said without much preamble, not people accused of fabricating evidence. People who've been genuinely wronged the way you were, who need someone willing to run the same blind test in a room full of people trying to break it. I've spent 20 years on the side that benefits when the truth stays murky. I find at this stage of my career that I'd rather spend what's left of it on the side that benefits when it doesn't. He has sent Lucid Forensics 11 referrals since that call, each one a genuine, uncompensated act of professional conscience from a man whose entire career I once assumed I understood completely. And each one a small, unglamorous reminder that people are, in the end, considerably more capable of changing course than the worst version of them ever suggests. The federal agency that had partnered with us throughout the Praxis Media Solutions investigation formally adopted our full detection suite as a standard verification tool across its regional field offices the following year. And two of the country's largest newsrooms, both of which had previously licensed only limited components of our technology, expanded their contracts to include the full suite within months of watching the blind test protocol hold up so cleanly in open court. I remember reading the formal adoption notice from the federal agency at my own desk, alone, on an entirely unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, and feeling something settle in my chest that I don't think I'd ever fully felt before that moment. Not triumph, exactly, but the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching an entire system finally catch up to a problem I had spent a decade of my life trying, alone, in a rented office above a dry cleaner, to get ahead of. I called Isabel first, then my mother, then, almost as an afterthought, Anjali, who replied within seconds. "I'm putting this on your tombstone one day. Here lies the sentient tax form who accidentally saved journalism." I laughed out loud at my desk, alone, in a way that startled the analyst working in the cubicle next to mine, and I thought, not for the first time, that it was a specifically strange and wonderful thing, building an entire life around correcting your father's worst tragedy, only to discover along the way that it also left considerable room for genuine, ordinary joy to grow up quietly around the edges of it. I learned more about why Chloe had let it happen than I ever expected to, mostly secondhand, through William, in the months after everything came apart. She had grown up, she'd apparently told her father in one of the few honest conversations they'd had since the boardroom, constantly aware that her entire identity inside Hawk Media Group's orbit was built on a single foundation, being William Beaumont's daughter, in a world where that fact opened every door, and simultaneously guaranteed that nobody could ever be entirely certain whether her own judgment, rather than her name, had earned her anything. Patrick, she'd said, had been the first person in years who made her feel valued for something that felt like her own decision-making rather than her lineage. And when he'd told her he had proof of my disloyalty, she had wanted, badly enough to override her own better instincts, to believe that trusting him was itself evidence of exactly the kind of independent judgment she'd spent her whole life trying to prove she had. "I don't think that excuses it," William told me, relaying this. "I want to be clear, I'm not asking you to feel sympathy for her. I just think you deserve to understand the shape of it, because I've spent considerable time recently understanding the shape of my own failures too, and I've come to believe none of us build these mistakes out of nothing. We build them out of whatever we were already afraid of before the opportunity to make the mistake ever arrived." Chloe found me in the Hawk Tower parking garage 3 nights after the board meeting, her makeup ruined in the specific way of someone who has spent the last 3 days alternating between fury and disbelief and has finally landed somewhere closer to exhaustion. "You could have just told me you suspected something," she said, arms crossed, not quite looking at me. "About Patrick, about my father's company, about any of it. Instead, I find out everything about the man I was engaged to marry in a single boardroom, in front of the entire board, at the same time as everyone else. I tried telling myself for a long time that not telling you was protecting the investigation," I said. "I think, if I'm honest, some part of it was also protecting myself from finding out sooner exactly how much of what we had was real." "Was any of it real?" she asked, and there was something underneath the anger in her voice that sounded, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain rather than performed. "I think I liked you for a while, in the shallow way you like someone who makes an unfamiliar building feel less unfamiliar," I said, because I owed her, if nothing else, the same honesty I'd finally started extending everyone else. "I don't think I ever let myself find out whether it could have become something more than that, because I was always, underneath everything, quietly investigating your family's company instead of actually building something with you. I'm not proud of that. I don't think it makes what Patrick did to me acceptable, but I don't think it makes what I did to you particularly admirable either." She didn't have anything to say to that for a long moment. "I didn't know he built a fake video," she said finally. "I want you to believe that, even if you don't believe anything else about me right now." "I believe you didn't build it," I said. "I'm considerably less certain you didn't suspect where it came from and decide not to ask, because asking might have gotten in the way of something you wanted to believe about Patrick instead." She didn't deny that. She simply stood there, in the cold, fluorescent light of an underground parking garage, looking, for the first time in 3 years, entirely without a script to perform. And then she turned and walked to her car without saying anything else. And that was, as far as I know, the last conversation either of us had while we were both still employed by the same company. Chloe left the company 2 months after the board meeting, not fired exactly, in the same way Patrick was fired outright. Her father simply stopped protecting her from the professional consequences of what she'd allowed to happen, and a woman whose entire career had been built on being William Beaumont's daughter discovered, in the absence of that protection, that she had never actually built anything of her own to fall back on. She sent me a single message weeks later that read only, "I should have asked where Patrick got that footage." I told myself not asking meant I wasn't responsible for what it did to you. I know now that's not how responsibility actually works. I didn't reply. Some apologies don't require an answer to be received. I sat through Patrick's deposition myself, 3 months into the case, in a windowless conference room considerably less dramatic than the boardroom where all of this had begun, opposite his attorney, a tired-looking man named Tobias Kent, who had clearly built an entire career out of representing exactly this kind of ambitious, overconfident client, and had long since stopped expecting any of them to make his job easier. "You're certain?" Kent asked me for the 3rd time that afternoon, in the leading, faintly accusatory tone attorneys use when they want a fact on the record without quite having the evidence to support the insinuation behind it. "That you had no advance knowledge of the specific timing of this footage's delivery to Mr. Beaumont's inbox?" "I'm certain," I said, which was, in the strictest sense, true, because suspecting Patrick was building towards something and knowing the precise hour a fabricated video would land in a chairman's inbox were 2 very different kinds of knowledge, and I had learned, over 6 increasingly careful days, exactly how to answer honestly about the first without needing to speculate about the second. "You seem remarkably composed for a man who nearly lost his career and his engagement in a single evening," Kent observed. "I had already lost my father to something considerably more devastating than a bad evening," I said, "long before I ever set foot in Hawk Media Group. I don't rattle as easily as your client seems to have hoped I would." Kent didn't have a follow-up for that. Patrick, sitting beside him, would not meet my eyes for the remainder of that session, and I understood, watching him stare fixedly at a spot on the conference table, that some part of him had finally, fully absorbed the specific humiliation of having spent 2 years assuming a quiet colleague was too unremarkable to be dangerous, and having been proven catastrophically wrong in the single most procedurally boring room available to prove anyone wrong in. He did eventually explain himself to me, unprompted, in the hallway outside that deposition, in a low, bitter voice clearly meant only for me to hear. "I watched you get handed things for 3 years that I worked twice as hard for," he said. "The board liked you. Chloe liked you. I told myself at some point that the only explanation was that you'd found some angle nobody else had access to, and I decided, if that was true, I was entitled to find my own angle too." "I didn't have an angle, Patrick," I told him. "I had a decade of grief and a company I built to answer it, and I kept both of those things private because I didn't think either of them was your business, or Hawk's, or anyone's, until you decided to weaponize a lie against me. You didn't lose to someone with an unfair advantage. You lost to someone who simply refused to build his entire career on convincing people of things that weren't true. The exact same refusal that's about to cost you everything." He didn't have anything to say to that either, and it was, as far as I know, the last real conversation we ever had. I want to admit something else about that period because I think it matters to the whole shape of this story. During the discovery phase of the case, Lucid Forensics' own systems, running standard analysis on a batch of communications subpoenaed from Patrick's work devices, surfaced a considerable amount of personal correspondence between Patrick and Chloe that had nothing to do with the fabricated video at all. Private, intimate messages spanning nearly a year. Evidence of an affair considerably more extensive than I had ever fully allowed myself to confirm while I was still nominally engaged to her. I could have released it. It would have been easy, and it would have been, in the specific, petty way certain kinds of revenge feel satisfying in the moment, an extremely effective way to humiliate both of them publicly, far beyond whatever legal consequences the fabricated video itself was going to bring. I didn't release it. I sat with the folder of correspondence for 2 full days before deciding, deliberately, that it had no legitimate bearing on the actual case against Patrick and Praxis Media Solutions, and that using it anyway would have made me exactly the kind of person who weaponizes private information simply because he has the technical means to do so, the precise instinct I had spent my entire career building tools to catch and condemn in other people. I deleted my own copy of that folder personally, off Lucid Forensics servers, and instructed our legal team to ensure only the narrowly relevant portions ever reached the actual court record. Isabel, when I told her about it afterwards, said only, "That's the difference between you and Praxis Media Solutions, Ethan. They'd have leaked it by lunchtime. You sat with it for 2 days and did the harder, quieter thing instead." I don't think I've ever been prouder of a decision that nobody outside this story will ever actually know I made. Patrick Thorne was indicted alongside Praxis Media Solutions ownership 8 months later on charges related to commissioning fabricated evidence and attempted securities fraud, given that the deepfake had been engineered specifically to influence a corporate leadership vote. He received a considerably lighter sentence than the forgery ring's operators, owing to his cooperation in identifying the specific account he'd used to commission the footage, but he did not, as far as I know, ever work in strategic communications again, which felt in the end like a fitting enough consequence for a man whose entire career had been built on manufacturing narratives more convincing than the truth. Isabel and I did not resolve things quickly, and I don't think either of us would have wanted it to happen quickly, given how much honesty we both still had to rebuild between us. It took the better part of 6 months, 6 months of working alongside each other on the Praxis Media Solutions case. 6 months of her slowly, deliberately deciding whether the man she'd known for 3 years as a demanding, occasionally obsessive anonymous client was someone she actually wanted to know completely, real name and all. The first month was, honestly, the hardest, because she treated me during that stretch with a scrupulous, unfailing professionalism that somehow hurt considerably more than open anger would have. She answered every question I asked about the case fully and precisely, copied me on every relevant finding, and gave me absolutely nothing beyond that. No warmth, no easy jokes, none of the small, familiar rhythms 3 years of working together had built between us before the truth came out. I understood it. I had earned exactly that distance. It didn't make sitting across a conference table from her day after day feel any less like slowly freezing. The second month, something shifted, almost imperceptibly. She started leaving her office door open again when she worked late, a habit she'd closed off entirely during month 1. And I took to walking past it most evenings on my way out, not stopping, just registering that the door was open, the way you register a small, deliberate signal you're not yet sure you're allowed to read as an invitation. In the third month, she finally let me bring her coffee again, the specific order I'd learned in our first year of working together and hadn't dared attempt since the boardroom. And she took it without comment, which I understood by then to be its own kind of small forgiveness. It was the fourth month, during a late night poring over Renata Ibarra's case file, that she finally said something that cracked the careful professional distance she'd maintained for 3 months straight. "I keep thinking about the version of the last 3 years where I actually knew you," she said, not looking up from her screen. "Not the version where I learned things about you 6 days before a board meeting, exposed all of it publicly. The version where you just told me at some point, quietly, the way you'd tell someone you trusted. I keep trying to figure out if that version was ever actually available to us, or if the secrecy was so load-bearing to how you survived your own life that there was never a version of us that didn't eventually run into it. I don't know," I told her honestly, because it was the only answer I actually had. I've spent 10 years building my entire identity around not being known. I don't think I understood, until I watched you go quiet on me for a month, how much that cost the people who were trying to actually know me anyway. She didn't say anything else that night, But the following week, she started, unprompted, telling me things she hadn't told me in 3 years of working together. A sister in another city she rarely spoke to. A father who'd raised her alone after her mother left. The specific reason she'd gone into forensic science in the first place. Her mother had left when Isabel was 9, without much explanation, and had resurfaced 11 years later with a story about the departure that Isabel's father, in the 2 decades since, had always quietly, gently contradicted in small, specific details whenever it came up. Not out of bitterness, she told me, but because he genuinely remembered events differently than her mother described them, and neither adult in her childhood had ever been willing to simply let the discrepancy stand unresolved. I spent my entire adolescence, she said, listening to 2 people who both clearly believed their own version completely, with no way for a teenager to determine which memory was more accurate or whether the truth was some third thing neither of them had quite managed to preserve honestly. I think I went into forensic science because I got tired, very young, of not having a way to actually verify anything. I wanted a field where there was, eventually, an actual checkable answer, instead of 2 people insisting on 2 different pasts and no way to reconcile them. That's not so different from why I built Lucid Forensics, I told her, and she nodded, already having drawn the connection herself days before I said it out loud. I know, she said. I think that's part of why I stayed angry at you for as long as I did. It felt for a while like discovering that even the one relationship in my life built entirely around verifiable, checkable truth had its own hidden, unverified layer running underneath it the whole time. I needed to work through that before I could let myself trust the rest of it again. By month 5, we were having dinner together most evenings, not officially anything, both of us too cautious to name it, and by month 6, sitting in the Lucid Forensics office long after everyone else had gone home, she finally told me that she'd stopped being angry sometime around month 4 and had simply been waiting to see whether I'd earned the right to know that. By month 5, we were having dinner together most evenings, not officially anything, both of us too cautious to name it. And by month 6, sitting in the Lucid Forensics office long after everyone else had gone home, she finally told me that she'd stopped being angry sometime around month 4 and had simply been waiting to see whether I'd earned the right to know that. You could have told me sooner, I said, echoing her own words back to her, and she almost smiled. I could have, she agreed. I think we're allowed exactly 1 dishonest silence each in this relationship, Ethan, and I've just used mine. I proposed 4 months after that, on an entirely ordinary Wednesday, because I had learned by then that Isabel distrusted grand romantic gestures roughly as much as I distrusted the idea of performing a version of myself for an audience, and because I understood, finally, that the truest thing I could offer her, after 3 years of secrecy followed by 6 months of careful rebuilding, was simply an ordinary moment handled honestly. I did it in the Lucid Forensics office, at her own desk, at the end of a completely unremarkable workday, holding a ring I'd picked out weeks earlier and had been too nervous to actually present. I don't have a speech, I told her, which was, itself, a small act of honesty, given how many drafts of a speech I had actually written and discarded over those weeks. I just know that the version of my life where you eventually decided to trust me again is considerably better than any version where you didn't, and I'd like to spend the rest of it making sure that trust keeps being worth what it cost you to extend it a second time. She looked at the ring for a long moment before she looked at me, and then she said, with the exact, dry, precise delivery she used for everything, including, apparently, the most important sentence of both our lives, "That's a considerably better proposal than most people manage with an actual speech." And then, before I could respond, she said yes, and kissed me. And the entire Lucid Forensics research floor, most of whom had clearly been pretending not to watch for several minutes, erupted into the kind of unguarded cheering that told me they'd been hoping for exactly this outcome for considerably longer than either of us had realized. I want to tell you about the actual decision to go public, because I don't think I made it quickly or easily, and I think the deliberation itself matters to understanding why I eventually did it. For nearly 2 months after the board meeting, with the case against Praxis Media Solutions already well underway, I told myself the anonymity could simply continue, that the federal case would proceed on its own evidentiary merits, regardless of whose name sat behind Lucid Forensics' corporate structure, and that I had no actual obligation to attach my father's story to a national news cycle simply because the truth about my ownership had already leaked out inside a single corporate boardroom. Isabel was the one who finally pushed back on that reasoning, gently but persistently, over several separate conversations. "You've spent 10 years telling yourself the anonymity protects the work," she said one evening, "and I understand why you built it that way. But I think, if you're honest with yourself, some part of the anonymity was also protecting you from ever having to fully grieve your father in public, the way you never got to grieve him properly the first time, because you were 17 and busy trying to hold your own family together instead. I think there's a version of you that needs to say his name out loud, to strangers, without a shell company standing between you and the saying of it. I don't think that version of you gets to exist as long as C. Finch does." I sat with that for nearly 3 weeks before I finally called the 2 federal agencies myself and asked whether they'd be willing to hold a joint press conference once the case concluded. One where I would speak not merely as Lucid Forensics founder, but specifically, by name, as Arthur Reed's son. I stepped out from behind Lucid Forensics' anonymous corporate structure publicly 6 months after the board meeting, at a press conference held jointly with the 2 federal agencies whose case against Praxis Media Solutions had just resulted in convictions across the board. It was, in its own quiet way, the hardest 5 minutes I have ever spent in front of a camera, considerably harder than the 90 seconds in Hawk's boardroom had been, because that room had at least been full of people I already knew were watching me. This was every stranger who would ever type my name into a search engine from that day forward, learning all at once both who I was and what had been done to my father. Isabel stood just off to the side of the podium the entire time, not close enough to appear in most of the photographs, but close enough that I could find her face in the crowd whenever my voice threatened to catch on a sentence I'd rehearsed a dozen times and still hadn't found a way to say without feeling the full weight of it. My mother sat in the second row next to Anjali, both of them holding hands the entire time, a small, unplanned solidarity between 2 women who had, in their own very different ways, spent years quietly believing in a version of me the rest of the world hadn't been allowed to see yet. I said his name at that press conference, in full, on purpose, for the first time in a public forum in a decade. My father, Arthur Reed, spent 20 years building a consulting firm on the principle that the truth was worth more than any client's convenience. He lost everything to a fabrication nobody could prove, 3 years before technology existed sophisticated enough to prove it, and he died believing the record would never be corrected. I built Lucid Forensics so that no family would ever again have to live with that particular kind of unproven grief. I'm telling you who I am today because I've spent 10 years hiding behind anonymity for reasons that made sense to a 17-year-old boy who just watched the world believe a lie over his own father. I don't need that particular kind of protection anymore. I'd rather my father's name be attached to the correction than left forever only attached to the lie. A reporter in the third row during the question period afterward asked me something I'd been asked 100 times by then in various forms, but never quite so directly. For people who don't understand the technology, can you explain simply how you actually know something is fake? Think of it like a forger trying to copy a painting, I said. A truly skilled forger can copy the brushstrokes almost perfectly, but almost is the important word. Real paint has physical texture, tiny ridges, subtle variations in thickness, the way light catches an actual brushstroke versus a printed approximation of one. A forger's copy might fool the eye from across a room, but hold it under the right light, at the right magnification, and the copy's seams show. Because reproducing something perfectly, down to every physical detail, is extraordinarily difficult, even when the reproduction looks convincing at a glance. Fabricated audio and video work the same way. The generative systems that create them are remarkably good at fooling a human eye or ear in real time. They are considerably worse at perfectly replicating the actual physics of the world they're imitating, how light truly bounces off a real surface, the precise chaotic timing of a genuine human expression, the specific acoustic signature of a real room's real dimensions. We built a very patient, very meticulous version of holding the painting under the right light. That's the whole secret. There's no magic in it. There's just patience, and a refusal to accept a convincing forgery as truth simply because convincing is difficult to argue with. I've used some version of that same painting analogy in nearly every public explanation I've given since, mostly because it's the only one that reliably makes a technical, statistical process feel graspable to someone without an engineering background. And because I think, in its own way, it says something true about my entire decade of work that no purely technical description ever quite manages to capture. That fighting a fabrication was never really about outsmarting a computer. It was about being more patient, more careful, more willing to look closely than whoever built the lie in the first place ever expected anyone to be. A middle school teacher wrote to me, several months after that press conference, saying she'd started using the painting analogy in her own classroom to teach media literacy to 12-year-olds, and that one of her students, unprompted, had asked whether that meant a person could learn to spot fakes the same careful way without needing an expensive piece of software at all. I told her yes, the teacher wrote, and that you'd probably be glad to know a room full of 7th graders now checks water glass reflections in videos before believing anything they see online. I printed that email and kept it, because it captured something I don't think I'd ever quite managed to say cleanly myself. That the actual goal, underneath everything, was never simply to build a company. It was to make an entire generation just slightly more stubborn about believing convenient lies. The exact stubbornness that had once, at 17, been the only thing standing between me and believing the world's version of my own father instead of my own. The press coverage that followed was, for the first week, considerably more intense than I had braced myself for, even having spent months anticipating it. My name appeared in 3 national outlets within 24 hours, alongside grainy archival photographs of my father from a decade earlier. And I spent that first week fielding interview requests I mostly declined, except for the 2 outlets that had co-published our forensic report on Praxis Media Solutions, because I felt they had earned the follow-up more than anyone chasing the story purely for its human interest angle. Anjali sent me a message on the 3rd day that read only, "Everyone in the building is losing their minds, in the best way." I told them I always knew you were up to something. Nobody believes me, which is somehow the funniest part. Dr. Sutton called me the same afternoon the story broke, her voice carrying the particular dry amusement she'd always used whenever one of her former students confirmed something she'd suspected long before they admitted it themselves. "I told you 12 years ago that you built your detection models like other people build shrines," she said, without so much as a hello first. I don't think either of us fully understood, at the time, exactly whose memory you were building the shrine to. I'm glad the rest of the world finally gets to see what I've known since your 2nd year of graduate school, that you were never simply building a company. You were building a correction to something the world owed your family and never paid. She paused and then added, in a voice considerably gentler than her usual clipped academic register, "Your father would be proud of you, Ethan. I only met the man twice, at your graduation and once at a conference years before that. But I remember him asking sharper questions about my own research than half the tenured faculty in that room. I always understood, watching you work, exactly whose curiosity you inherited." The broader forensics industry's reaction, once the dust settled, surprised me more than I expected it to. 2 rival firms, both considerably larger than Lucid Forensics had been for most of its existence, issued public statements praising the rigor of our methodology and specifically citing the blind test protocol Isabel had designed as a model the entire industry should consider adopting as standard practice. A 3rd firm, smaller and considerably more defensive, tried, briefly, to cast doubt on our findings in a poorly received public statement, only to quietly retract it a week later once several of the same universities that had helped run our blind test independently confirmed our results using their own equipment. I understood, watching that particular retraction happen, that the industry I had built my entire adult life around was, in its own slow, occasionally petty way, finally maturing into something my 17-year-old self would have given almost anything to have existed a decade sooner. Not everyone was convinced, of course, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend the public reaction was uniformly celebratory. A vocal, persistent segment of online commentary spent the first several weeks after the reveal insisting the entire story was itself suspiciously convenient. A man discovered to secretly own a deepfake detection company at the exact moment he needed one. Using it to clear his own name in a boardroom was, several commentators pointed out, Precisely the kind of narrative a genuinely guilty person with enough resources might construct to look innocent. I understood the skepticism, even as it stung, because I had spent my entire career teaching people to distrust convenient stories that couldn't be independently verified. And I recognized the uncomfortable irony of now being on the receiving end of exactly that same healthy skepticism. I welcomed it in the end rather than resenting it, and I made sure Lucid Forensics' own public statement specifically invited independent verification of every claim I'd made, including full access to the blind test protocol for any outside institution that wanted to run it themselves. 3 separate universities did exactly that over the following 6 months, each one independently confirming both the authenticity of my own cleared footage and the fabricated status of the original video used against me. The skepticism, I came to believe, wasn't an obstacle to what I'd built. It was the entire point of it, a world finally sophisticated enough to demand proof instead of simply believing whichever story arrived first. Exactly the world my father had needed and never gotten. Anjali herself, it turned out, had been quietly building her own case for a promotion throughout the entire ordeal, using the exact meticulous documentation habits she'd developed while covering for me over 3 years. And when Hawk Media Group finally restructured its strategy division in the aftermath of Patrick Thorne's departure, I made sure, this time without any need for secrecy, that her name was the first one put forward for the position Patrick had once occupied. She took it, and she has run that division for 2 years now with a specific, no-nonsense competence that has made her, by every account I hear, considerably better at the job than Patrick ever managed to be. Mostly because she has never once needed to manufacture a narrative to justify her own results. I stayed at Hawk Media Group myself for another full year after the boardroom, splitting my time increasingly openly between my official VP role and Lucid Forensics' expanding operations, before finally stepping down to focus entirely on the company I'd spent a decade building in secret. In that final year, I made a point of doing something I'd never once allowed myself to do during my 3 years of careful, deliberate anonymity. I mentored, openly, whichever junior analysts on my team showed the specific, stubborn attention to detail I'd spent my whole career trying to cultivate in myself. One of them, a data analyst barely 2 years out of college named Jordan Amani, came to me 6 months before I left, convinced he'd found a discrepancy in a routine vendor report that everyone else on his team had already signed off on. He was nervous showing it to me, the way junior employees are nervous showing anything to a VP whose entire professional reputation had recently become the subject of a national news story. And I recognized, watching him hesitate in my doorway, the exact same posture I imagined Leo would bring to my own office at Lucid Forensics a year later, though I hadn't met Leo yet at the time. "Walk me through what you found," I told him, and he did, carefully, methodically, and it turned out he was right. A vendor had been quietly padding an invoice in a way sophisticated enough that it had slipped past 2 rounds of standard review. "You just caught something 2 more senior analysts missed," I told him. "Do you know why?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I just couldn't stop looking at it. Something felt off, even though the numbers technically reconciled." "That instinct," I said, "the one that won't let you stop looking even after everything technically checks out. That's the only part of this job that actually matters. Everything else is a skill you can teach anyone. That specific stubbornness, you either have or you don't, and you have it. Don't let anyone, including yourself on a tired day, talk you out of trusting it." I promoted him to lead analyst on his team within the month. The same quiet, deliberate correction of the record I'd wished, for a decade, someone had extended my own father before it was too late to matter. My mother's reaction to the press conference was the one I had, honestly, been most afraid of in the months leading up to it, because I had spent a decade protecting her from precisely this kind of renewed public attention to my father's story, worried that reopening it, even to correct it, would simply reopen a wound she had spent 10 years learning to live around. She called me the morning after the press conference aired, and I braced myself answering, for exactly the kind of gentle, worried disappointment I had spent months anticipating. "I watched it 4 times, she told me instead, her voice thick in a way I hadn't heard since the week of the funeral. "I recorded it, and I've watched it 4 times, and I want you to know that your father would have been unbearably proud of you, and also considerably annoyed that it took you a decade to tell anyone the truth about what you were actually building all this time. He always said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met. I don't think either of us fully understood until this week exactly what that stubbornness was quietly capable of. I drove out to see her the following weekend, Isabel in the passenger seat, both of us slightly nervous in the specific, unspoken way you're nervous introducing someone who matters to you to the person whose opinion of them you care most about. My mother had prepared an entire dinner, considerably more elaborate than anything she typically cooked for just the two of us, and I understood, watching her fuss over serving dishes she rarely used anymore, that this dinner mattered to her as more than a simple family meal. It was the first time in a decade she'd been able to host anyone in her home without the specific, low-grade dread of wondering whether the guest secretly still believed the old rumors about my father. "Your son spent 3 years lying to me about his entire professional identity," Isabel told my mother over dinner, with a directness that made me nearly choke on my water, though my mother, to my surprise, laughed outright. "He gets that from his father, actually," she said, refilling Isabel's glass. "Arthur kept his own counsel about almost everything until the exact moment he'd decided he was ready to share it, and not 1 second sooner. It used to drive me half out of my mind. I eventually decided it was simply the price of loving someone who thought that carefully before he ever opened his mouth about anything that mattered." She looked at me, something soft and unguarded in her expression that I hadn't seen from her in years. "I think you found someone who's willing to pay that same price, Ethan. I hope you know how rare that actually is." My mother and Isabel became genuinely close over the following months, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, mostly built around a shared, slightly competitive enthusiasm for a specific true crime podcast series that examined, of all things, historical cases of manipulated evidence, several decades before any forensic technology existed to properly analyze them. They started a standing weekly phone call, ostensibly to discuss the latest episode, though I gathered from the length of some of those calls that the podcast episodes themselves eventually became almost incidental to the actual conversation. My mother told me one evening that talking to Isabel felt like getting to know a version of her own younger self she'd never quite had the confidence to fully become. Someone who trusted her own careful judgment enough to act on it without needing outside validation first. I think in Isabel, my mother also finally found someone who could talk about my father's case with the specific, unflinching technical precision she'd spent a decade wishing someone had been capable of offering her a decade earlier, when all she'd had instead was grief and no way to prove any of it. Isabel reached under the table and found my hand, and I understood, sitting at that table, in the house my mother had rebuilt her entire life around after losing everything else, that this particular dinner, ordinary, slightly awkward, full of gentle teasing about my worst personality trait, was its own, quiet, complete kind of victory, considerably larger than any boardroom reveal or congressional hearing had ever managed to feel. Before we left that night, my mother pulled a small, worn cardboard box down from a closet shelf and handed it to me without much explanation. Inside were things I hadn't seen in a decade, my father's old business cards, a stack of thank you letters from clients spanning his entire career, and at the very bottom, the actual Little League roster from the last season he coached. Every kid's name in his own careful handwriting, along with small, private notes about each one's batting stance that only a coach who genuinely loved the work would ever have bothered writing down. "I couldn't bring myself to look at this box for 10 years, she told me. "I think I can now. I think you built something that finally lets me look at who he actually was, instead of just what was done to him." I didn't trust myself to say anything back. I simply held the box and let her see for the first time in a decade that I couldn't either. I drove out to the cemetery alone the following morning before heading back to the city, the way I did several times a year, though I brought something with me that visit I never had before. A printed transcript of my congressional testimony, my father's full name typed cleanly across the opening page. I sat on the grass beside his headstone for a long time before I said anything at all, the way I always do, because grief, it turns out, does not actually require you to fill every silence with words. "We got it back," I told him finally, quietly, the paper resting on my knee. "Not all of it. I don't think all of it is a thing that's actually possible to get back. But the part that was still provable, we proved. I built the tool you needed a decade before it existed. I used it exactly the way I always told myself I would, if I ever got the chance. My voice did the thing it always does at this exact point. The small catch that never quite smooths out no matter how many times I practice this conversation in my head on the drive over. I met someone, Dad. She's better at this work than I am, and she still hasn't decided I've fully earned her trust back. And I think you'd have liked that about her more than almost anything else. I don't know if grief ever actually resolves into something you'd call peace. I think some days it simply becomes quieter, less like a wound and more like a room in a house you've learned to walk through without stubbing your toe on the same furniture every single time. I sat with him until the light started to go gold and low across the grass, and then I got up, brushed the grass off my knees, and drove back into the city because there was still a company to run and a name to keep correcting, and a woman waiting for me who had, slowly, deliberately, decided I was worth the risk of trusting completely. Senator Marchetti won her seat back the following election cycle, running this time on a platform that included, alongside her original chemical safety agenda, a legislative push for stronger legal standards around synthetic media evidence, testimony she asked me to help her draft, specifically citing the blind test protocol Isabel had designed as a model for how courts everywhere should be handling exactly this kind of evidence. Renata Ibarra regained full custody of her children within 3 months of the forensic report's publication, and she sent me the following year a photograph of her daughter's school science fair project, a poster board titled "How to Catch a Fake," built with her mother's help, that remains to this day taped inside my own office beside Calvin Albright's quote. Because I think it says, in a child's careful handwriting, everything I ever wanted lucid forensics to actually accomplish. Both women check in with me once a year now, always around the anniversary of the forensic report's publication, an unplanned tradition neither of us ever formally proposed, but that simply started happening on its own. Senator Marchetti's message is always brisk and brief. A line about pending legislation, a reminder that the fight for stronger evidentiary standards is never actually finished, and some variation of the same closing sentence every year. Keep building the tools, Ethan. The people trying to abuse this technology are not going to stop innovating just because we caught one of them. Renata Ibarra's message is always warmer, usually a new photograph of her children, now old enough themselves to understand, in broad strokes, what happened to their family and why. I have never once needed either of them to remind me what the actual stakes of my work are. I keep their messages anyway, because I think it matters to remember, on the ordinary days when the work feels like nothing more than spreadsheets and server maintenance, exactly whose lives that unglamorous work is quietly, continuously protecting. The week after the press conference, Lucid Forensics' website changed for the first time in a decade, replacing the anonymous, founded by C. Finch line that had sat quietly at the bottom of the About page since the company's earliest years, with a full page bearing my actual name, my actual photograph, and, at Isabel's specific, insistent suggestion, a short paragraph about my father that had taken us 3 separate drafting sessions to get right, because every version I wrote on my own came out either too clinical or too raw. And it took her steady, careful editing to find the version that finally felt honest without collapsing into something maudlin. I remember sitting at my desk the morning the new page went live, refreshing it several times simply to watch my own name load, in the same specific, quiet disbelief I imagine my father must have felt the first time he saw his own company's name printed on a garage door 2 decades earlier. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes with finally attaching your real identity to something you spent a decade building under a fiction. And I don't think anyone warns you about it, because from the outside it looks like the easiest part of the whole ordeal. A website update, a new photograph, a paragraph of copy. When in reality, it took me the better part of a year to stop flinching, slightly, every time a client or journalist said, "Ethan Reed," instead of "Mr. Finch," in a professional context. The way you flinch at a sound you associate with exposure long after the actual danger has passed. Hawk Media Group established the Arthur Reed Fellowship in Digital Forensics the following spring, fully funded, aimed at training the next generation of forensic analysts capable of doing exactly the work Lucid Forensics does, a gesture William Beaumont insisted on personally, over the objections of board members who worried it would draw unwelcome attention back to Victor Hawk's history. "Let it draw attention," William told them, in a meeting I was invited to specifically so I could hear him say it. "We've spent this company's entire recent history trying to bury inconvenient history instead of correcting it. I'd like to try, for what remains of my own career, doing the opposite." The fellowship's first graduating class, 4 years later, produced 11 newly credentialed forensic analysts, 3 of whom Lucid Forensics hired directly, and one of whom, a quiet, determined young woman named Zara Kennedy, gave a graduation speech that I attended specifically because William had personally asked me to, still uneasy, even years later, about how much of the spotlight from that program he genuinely wanted attached to his own name rather than mine. I applied to this fellowship because my own grandmother lost her small business to a rumor nobody could ever trace back to its source, decades before any of this technology existed to prove it false, Zara told the graduating class. "I don't know if I'll ever get to prove that specific case wrong. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence is gone. But I know that somewhere right now, there's a family living through exactly what mine lived through. And I'd like to be the person who shows up in time to actually help them, the way nobody showed up in time for my grandmother, or, from what I understand, for Mr. Reed's father either." She found me in the audience afterward, and though I have met a great many people since the reveal who wanted to tell me some version of how my father's story had shaped their own career choices, I don't think any of those conversations has ever moved me quite the way that one did, mostly because I recognized in her the exact same quiet, specific devotion Dr. Sutton had once accused me of building, a decade before either of us understood how many other families were quietly carrying the same unresolved grief, waiting for someone patient enough to finally build them a way to prove it. Lucid Forensics has since offered Zara a standing invitation to design her own research track investigating cold case fabrications from the era before detection technology existed. A slow, painstaking archival project with no guarantee of ever finding anything conclusive, given how much physical and digital evidence simply degrades or disappears entirely over enough decades. She accepted immediately, telling me it was, in her words, "the only job I've ever wanted that pays me to keep looking for my grandmother's answer, even if I never find it." I understand that particular motivation more completely than almost anyone else could, and I have made sure, in every budget cycle since, that her project remains fully funded, regardless of whether it ever produces a single publishable result. Because some kinds of work are worth doing, even when the odds of a clean, satisfying ending are considerably lower than any of us would prefer. Isabel's father, Leonard Ramirez, a quiet, watchful man who had raised her alone since she was 9, and who I met properly for the first time only 3 months before the wedding, took me aside during the rehearsal dinner and told me, with the specific bluntness of a father who has spent 2 decades protecting a daughter from people who didn't deserve her trust. Isabel told me the whole story. All of it. The secrecy, the boardroom, the 6 months it took her to decide whether to forgive you for it. He studied me for a long moment. "I want you to understand that I'm not going to pretend the secrecy doesn't concern me, but I raised a daughter who verifies everything before she believes it, professionally and personally both, and she's decided, after considerable verification, that you're worth trusting completely. I've learned to trust her judgment more than almost anyone else's, including my own, so I'm choosing to trust it here too." It was, I understood, about as warm a blessing as Leonard Ramirez was constitutionally capable of offering, and I received it exactly as gratefully as it was intended. Isabel and I married 2 years after that boardroom night, in a small ceremony neither of us wanted to turn into the kind of media event my public reveal might otherwise have invited, held instead in the converted warehouse space that now houses Lucid Forensics' expanded research floor, surrounded by the exact team of forensic analysts who had spent 4 months helping me take apart Praxis Media Solutions, one rendering fingerprint at a time. My mother attended, the first Reed family event she'd been able to attend without needing, beforehand, to brace herself against the possibility of some fresh humiliation arriving to compound the old one. She cried during the toast, quietly, the way she'd never once let herself cry in the 10 years since my father died, and told me afterward that it was the first time in a decade she'd been able to say his name out loud in a room full of people without immediately needing to explain, defensively, that the terrible things once said about him weren't true. Senator Marchetti flew in for the ceremony, despite a packed legislative calendar, and sat by unplanned coincidence at the same table as Renata Ibarra, the two of them spending most of the reception deep in conversation about school board politics in Renata's district, a conversation that eventually led, 18 months later, to Renata running successfully for a seat on that very board, a small, unplanned ripple of the same case that had first brought them both into my life. Anjali brought a +1, who spent the entire evening asking me increasingly detailed technical questions about waveform analysis, until Anjali finally, affectionately, told him to let the man enjoy his own wedding for God's sake. Even Judge Navarro sent a card, a brief, dry note that read only, 10 for 10 remains the most elegant piece of courtroom theater I've witnessed in 30 years on the bench. Congratulations to you both. William Beaumont attended alone, Eleanor having passed several years earlier, and gave a short, quiet toast near the end of the evening that surprised me more than almost anything else that night. I've spent considerable time since that boardroom trying to understand what I actually owe this young man, he said, raising his glass toward Isabel and me. I've decided the honest answer is that I owe him a debt I can't actually repay, because you cannot give someone back a father, or a decade, or the version of a childhood that decade should have contained. What I can do is make sure the rest of my own career, however much of it remains, is spent building things that don't require this kind of correction 10 years too late. Ethan, Isabel, I wish you both a marriage built on considerably fewer secrets than the one that brought you together. And I mean that with the full weight of everything I've learned this past 3 years. Isabel and I spent our honeymoon somewhere neither of us had ever told anyone we secretly wanted to visit. A small, unremarkable coastal town with no cell service, and a single excellent seafood restaurant we ate at 4 nights out of the 7 we stayed, mostly in comfortable silence, both of us finally fully off duty for the first time in nearly 2 years. On the last night, sitting on the porch of the small rental cottage we'd found, Isabel asked me whether, given the choice, I'd have built lucid forensics at all if it meant my father never had to suffer through what created the need for it in the first place. Of course, I told her without hesitation. I'd trade every patent, every federal contract, every ounce of this company's reputation for one version of this story where he's still alive, and none of it was ever necessary. But that's not the choice I was actually given. The choice I was given was between building something out of what happened or letting what happened simply be the end of the story. I chose to build something. I don't regret that choice. I just wish every single day that the world hadn't required it of me in the first place. She didn't say anything to that, just reached over and laced her fingers through mine, and we sat there together until the tide came all the way in. The specific, quiet completeness of two people who had both, in their own separate ways, spent years learning that some kinds of peace only arrive after you've done the hard, patient work of earning them honestly. Isabel's toast, when it came, was considerably more composed than mine, though she confessed afterward that composure had taken her most of the previous night to rehearse into existence. I spent 3 years, she said, raising her glass toward a room full of people who had by then mostly heard some version of our story secondhand, working for a man I knew as C. Finch, who I thought was simply the most demanding, detail-obsessed client Lucid Forensics had ever had. It took me 3 years and 1 boardroom scandal to learn his actual name. I want everyone here to know that I don't regret a single hour of those 3 years, misleading as parts of them were, because they taught me something about Ethan I don't think I would have learned any other way. That even hiding behind an entirely fabricated professional identity, the man underneath it never once compromised on the truth of his actual work. I fell in love, somewhere in there, with a version of honesty that took the long way around to reach me, and I've decided, on balance, that the long way was worth it. She raised her glass a fraction higher. To Ethan, and to his father, who I never got to meet, but who I think would recognize, in tonight, exactly the kind of company he always tried to build himself. Anjali gave the second toast, considerably less composed and considerably funnier, opening with, I wanted on record that I knew something was going on for at least 2 years before any of the rest of you found out, and nobody believed me, and I would like a formal apology from this entire room, which got the exact laugh she was aiming for, before turning, unexpectedly, sincere. I've worked with a lot of people in this industry who spent their careers building narratives more convincing than the truth. Ethan spent his entire career, in secret, building the opposite. The tools to catch exactly that kind of narrative before it could do to anyone else what it did to his father. I'm proud to have spent 3 years, even mostly in the dark, working next to someone doing that quietly, without ever once asking for credit for it. I'm glad the credit finally found him anyway. We received a gift from William Beaumont that I still keep on my office desk. An antique magnifying glass in a worn brass case. No note attached except a single line in his own handwriting. For the parts of the truth that are hardest to see clearly. I have never fully decided whether it was meant as an apology, an acknowledgement, or simply the closest thing William Beaumont has ever managed to genuine tenderness. And I have decided, in the end, that it doesn't especially matter which. I keep it anyway, next to Calvin Albright's quote and Renata Ibarra's daughter's science fair poster. 3 small, unrelated objects that have, together, come to represent everything this entire ordeal actually taught me. I think about the 17-year-old version of myself sometimes, sitting at that kitchen table listening to a recording that would end his father's life in slow motion, utterly certain that nothing could ever be done about a lie convincing enough to sound like the truth. I built an entire company and spent a decade of my life proving that boy wrong. I didn't do it with some secret magical gift. I did it with code and patience and the specific, stubborn refusal to accept that a fabrication should simply get to stand unchallenged because proving it fake felt too difficult, or too late, or too inconvenient for the people who'd benefited from everyone believing it. William Beaumont and I have lunch every quarter now, an arrangement neither of us formally proposed, but that simply started happening, once a season. Always at the same unremarkable diner 2 blocks from Hawk Tower, where he first told me, 3 weeks after the board meeting, that he had ordered his general counsel to disclose everything voluntarily to federal investigators. We don't talk about Victor Hawk much, or about the ledger, or about the specific decade my father spent believing nobody would ever prove what had been done to him. We talk about the fellowship program mostly, and about Anjali's steady, unglamorous rise through strategy, which he mentions every single time with the specific quiet pride of a chairman finally learning to notice competence that doesn't come wrapped in charm. And about Chloe, who he tells me every quarter is doing better, slowly, in the specific way people do better when they've finally stopped needing an audience to validate the doing. I don't expect you to have forgiven any of it, William told me at one of these lunches, a little over a year after the boardroom, turning his coffee cup in slow circles the way he does whenever he's working up to saying something he finds difficult. I wouldn't ask you to. I just want you to know that not a single quarter goes by where I don't think about the 20 years it took your father to build something my predecessor helped tear down for the sake of an advertising relationship that turned out to matter considerably less than the decade of grief it caused. These lunches are the only accounting I know how to actually offer that doesn't feel like it's asking something from you in return. I don't come to these lunches for accounting, William, I told him, and I meant it. I come because Lucid Forensics and Hawk Media Group are going to keep doing business with each other for the rest of both our careers, whether either of us particularly enjoys the history behind that fact. And I've decided I'd rather build that relationship on quarterly lunches at a diner than on quiet resentment neither of us ever says out loud. My father always believed the safest business relationship is the one built on the version of the truth you're both willing to keep saying, even when it's uncomfortable. This is me trying that his way, for once. William retired 3 years after the boardroom, earlier than most industry observers expected, handing the chairmanship to a considerably younger executive he'd spent his final 2 years deliberately, publicly mentoring, rather than quietly grooming a successor the way his own predecessor once had. He called me the week before the announcement out of courtesy rather than obligation, and told me in the same unhurried voice he'd used at that first devastating board meeting, "I've spent my whole career building things quietly enough that nobody asked too many uncomfortable questions about how they were built. I'd like whatever time I have left to spend building things loudly enough that the questions get asked before anyone has the chance to bury them for a decade. I think that's the only inheritance I actually want to leave this company." I told him I thought that was a considerably better legacy than the one he'd nearly settled for, and I meant it. Lucid Forensics received its first major industry recognition the following spring, a Technology Ethics Award from a National Journalism Foundation, presented at a ceremony Isabel initially had to talk me into attending, given how uncomfortable I still found any event built around public recognition rather than quiet, unglamorous work. I gave a short acceptance speech that night, considerably shorter than the organizers had requested, because I had learned by then exactly how much weight a few honest sentences could carry compared to a long, polished one. "This award technically belongs to a company," I said. "I'd like it instead to belong to every family who ever sat at a kitchen table listening to a recording of themselves saying something they never said, with no way at the time to prove otherwise. We built the way to prove otherwise. I only wish we'd built it in time for my own father." I testified before a congressional subcommittee on synthetic media legislation 18 months after the boardroom, sitting beside Senator Marchetti, who had by then become the chamber's most vocal advocate for updated evidentiary standards around fabricated audio and video. I told the story of my father's case in full, in front of cameras, for the first time in a public forum with actual legislative stakes attached. One committee member, a skeptical senior representative from a district several states over, pressed me hard during the question period, in the specific, faintly condescending tone of someone who has decided in advance that a witness is overselling a problem for personal or commercial gain. "Mr. Reed, isn't it true that your company stands to profit considerably from legislation mandating exactly the kind of forensic services you sell?" "It's true that Lucid Forensics would benefit from expanded demand for verification services," I said calmly, because I had anticipated exactly this question and had no interest in pretending otherwise. I'd asked the committee to weigh that fact against another one. My father died believing there would never be a way to prove what was done to him, 3 years before the technology to prove it existed. I would have traded every dollar Lucid Forensics has ever earned for that technology to have existed 3 years sooner. I'm not here because legislation is good for my business, Congressman. I'm here because I've personally watched what happens to families in the gap this legislation is designed to close. And I don't think that gap should exist for 1 day longer than absolutely necessary, regardless of what it does or doesn't do for my company's revenue. The room was quiet for a moment after that, and Senator Marchetti, sitting beside me, reached over and briefly touched my arm, the small, wordless gesture of someone who understood exactly what that answer had cost me to give, live, in front of cameras, to a room full of strangers who hadn't earned the right to hear it, but needed to anyway. I watched, testifying, several committee members visibly recalculating the scale of a problem they had, until that hearing mostly treated as a distant, theoretical concern, rather than something that had already quietly ended careers and cost mothers custody of their own children for years at a time. The legislation that eventually passed, 11 months later, established, among other provisions, mandatory chain of custody standards for any synthetic media evidence used in federal proceedings. Standards built substantially on the blind test protocol Isabel had designed for a single custody case retrial in a courtroom annex nobody outside that building had ever heard of. I want to tell you about the hardest case Lucid Forensics ever handled after the reveal, because I think it says more about what the company actually stands for than any of the victories I've described so far. A year after the boardroom, a journalist I respected, someone whose work I had followed for years, and who had, in fact, been one of the 2 reporters who'd co-published our Praxis Media Solutions investigation, submitted a piece of footage to our analysis suite privately, off the record, asking us to verify whether a recording was genuine before she ran a story built around it. The recording appeared to capture a prominent public figure, someone I happened to personally admire, whose work on media literacy had, in small ways, influenced how I thought about Lucid Forensics' own mission, making a series of genuinely damaging private remarks. Our system flagged it as authentic, genuinely, unambiguously authentic, with the same confidence level our reports had used to clear my own name in that boardroom a year earlier. I sat with that result for a long time before signing off on it, because some small, uncomfortable part of me wanted, badly, to find some reason to doubt a conclusion I didn't want to be true. I understood, sitting there, exactly the temptation Praxis Media Solutions clients must have felt on the other side of this equation. Not the temptation to fabricate evidence, but the considerably more human temptation to distrust a genuine result simply because you didn't like where it led. I signed off on the authentication anyway. The story ran. The public figure's reputation suffered, deservedly, for something he had actually said and actually meant. And I remember feeling, watching the story unfold, a very specific, uncomfortable kind of integrity. The recognition that lucid forensics' entire value depended on the technology being equally rigorous, whether the truth was convenient or not, equally willing to clear an innocent man in a boardroom and condemn a genuinely guilty one whose work I happened to respect. Isabel, watching me struggle with it that week, told me something I've kept close ever since. You didn't build this company to protect people you like, Ethan. You built it to protect the truth, regardless of who it protects or condemns. The day you start making exceptions for people you personally admire is the day this company becomes exactly the thing Praxis Media Solutions was, just with better intentions attached to the same dishonesty. A considerably less sympathetic version of that same test arrived 18 months later when a wealthy prospective client, the CEO of a mid-sized manufacturing firm, facing a genuinely damaging piece of authentic video evidence in an ongoing lawsuit, offered Lucid Forensics an amount of money large enough that his own attorney seemed faintly embarrassed relaying it, in exchange for what he described euphemistically as a thorough second opinion on footage our own system had already flagged as authentic beyond any reasonable dispute. I took that meeting myself, specifically so there could be no ambiguity about who had delivered the answer. I understand you're hoping for a different result, I told him. I want to be direct with you. Our analysis is authentic, and no amount of additional fees changes what the underlying data actually shows. If you'd like, I'm happy to walk you through the full technical basis for that finding. What I won't do, at any price, is manufacture a different conclusion to make an inconvenient truth disappear. Because the entire reason this company exists is that someone once did exactly that to my own family. And I have spent a decade making sure nobody else ever has to live through what it cost us. He left considerably angrier than he'd arrived, and Lucid Forensics never heard from him again, which struck me, at the time, as the single clearest possible confirmation that I had made the correct decision. Lucid Forensics hired its 400th employee the year after that, a quiet, meticulous recent graduate named Leo Mendoza, who reminded me, more than I think he ever realized, of myself at 22. The same obsessive attention to the smallest possible seam in a piece of manipulated media. The same specific, stubborn refusal to accept that a fabrication should stand simply because proving it fake felt inconvenient. He came to me 4 months into the job, hesitant, holding a printout of an anomaly he'd found in a client's submitted footage that our automated system had initially cleared as authentic. A subtle inconsistency he'd caught only because he'd insisted on running a manual secondary review nobody had explicitly assigned him to do. I know the system already cleared this, he said, standing in my office doorway with the specific, careful posture of someone bracing to be told he was overreacting. I couldn't stop looking at it. Something felt wrong, even though every automated flag came back clean. I looked at his printout for a long time before I said anything, because I recognized in his hesitation the exact same instinct that had once made a 17-year-old boy refuse to believe a convincing recording over his own father's word. An instinct that no automated system, however sophisticated, would ever fully replace. The footage, once we ran a full manual review, turned out to be a considerably more sophisticated fabrication than anything our detection suite had encountered before, produced by a service that had clearly studied our own public methodology closely enough to engineer around several of its known detection markers. A genuinely alarming discovery, and also, I understood immediately, an invaluable one, because it meant our system needed updating before whoever built it moved on to a less careful client. We traced that particular service over the following 3 months to a small operation working almost entirely out of encrypted channels, considerably more sophisticated technically than Praxis Media Solutions had ever managed to be, and considerably more careful about covering its own tracks. It took Leo's team the better part of a year to build a case solid enough for federal prosecutors to act on, work that ultimately led to the arrest of its 2 founders and the disruption of what turned out to be an even larger commissioned forgery operation than Praxis Media Solutions had ever run. This one specializing almost exclusively in corporate espionage cases rather than personal reputation attacks. Leo received an internal commendation for the discovery, the first of what has since become several, and he told me, accepting it, with a directness that reminded me sharply of my own younger self, "I don't want the commendation because I did something impressive. I want it because it means the company is actually listening when someone junior says something feels wrong, even when the system says everything's fine. That's the only reason I took this job in the first place." "You just found something 400 employees and an automated system missed," I told him. "That instinct you just described, the one that wouldn't let you stop looking even after the system cleared it, that's the actual job, Leo. The system is a tool. It's not a replacement for the specific stubborn refusal to accept an answer that doesn't sit right. Don't ever let anyone, including our own software, talk you out of trusting that instinct." He didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said quietly, "I want to keep doing this for a long time." And I understood, hearing it, that this, not the congressional testimony, not the fellowship program, not even the legislation now bearing Isabel's protocol's fingerprints in its language, was the actual, final proof that everything I'd built out of a decade-old grief had taken root somewhere solid enough to outlast me. I should tell you before I finish about the specific piece of software I plugged into that boardroom terminal, because I think it matters that it wasn't some dramatic, purpose-built weapon I'd secretly designed for exactly this confrontation. It was the same client-facing authentication suite Lucid Forensics licensed to newsrooms and courts and federal agencies every single day. The identical interface Isabel's team used dozens of times a week on entirely unremarkable cases. I hadn't built anything new for that boardroom. I had simply, finally, been willing to use the ordinary, unglamorous tool I'd already spent a decade building on the one case I had spent that entire decade too afraid to point it at directly. My own life. In the moment, it was actively being dismantled by exactly the kind of lie that had once dismantled my father's. I think that's the part of this story I most want people to actually take away from it, more than the boardroom drama or the federal indictment or even the follower bearing my father's name. The tool that saved me wasn't secret or rare or built specifically for heroes. It was ordinary, patient, methodical work, available to anyone willing to build it and use it consistently. The same unglamorous kind of diligence Laura Harding once used to keep her own protective notes. The same instinct Leo Mendoza and Jordan Amani both trusted, even when an automated system told them they were wrong to keep looking. My father lost everything to a lie because the tools to catch it didn't exist yet. I didn't build something magical to make sure that never happened again. I just built, patiently, over a decade, the ordinary, checkable proof that should have existed all along. 2 years after the boardroom, I ran into Chloe at an industry conference neither of us had expected the other to be attending. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, entirely unguarded. Working now, she told me, at a small nonprofit focused on media literacy education. A career pivot, she said, had started the week after she read the full forensic report on Praxis Media Solutions and realized, reading it, that she had spent her entire adult life inside an industry she'd never once seriously interrogated the ethics of. "I don't expect you to think it makes up for anything," she said. "I just wanted you to know it happened, and that it happened because of what you exposed, not in spite of it." I told her honestly that I was glad, and that I meant it, and I found saying it that I did. I still think, more often than I probably should, about the 17-year-old version of myself sitting at that kitchen table, listening to a recording end his father's life in slow motion, certain that nothing could ever be done about a lie convincing enough to sound like the truth. I built an entire career and spent a decade of my adult life proving that boy wrong, one patient, unglamorous case at a time. There is a version of this story that ends with me finally getting to confront the people responsible for my father's ruin. And there is a version that ends with the boardroom, the 90 seconds, the water glass reflection nobody else had thought to check. I don't think either of those is actually the true ending, though. The true ending, I think, is Jordan Amani refusing to let a report reconcile away a feeling that something was wrong. It's Leo Mendez staying 4 extra hours because an automated system's clean result didn't sit right with him. It's a child in Renata Ibarra's living room building a school poster about how to catch a fake, in crayon, because her mother made sure she grew up understanding that the truth is always, eventually, checkable, if you're patient enough and willing enough to look. My father needed exactly one person, one tool, 1 ounce of proof, 3 years before any of it existed. I spent a decade making sure the next family who needed it wouldn't have to wait.